Hey Earthlings, welcome to the Earth is Square's full Vue 3 tutorial course. My name is Mitchell. I'm going to be walking you guys through all the steps to get your own Vue 3 application up and running and deployed to production by the end of the video. Let's just get straight into it with the course introduction. And first off, to give us something to latch onto throughout the application, to give us some ideas and something to work with, we're actually going to be building a Twitter clone called Twitter using the Vue 3 framework. Now, if you guys want to skip ahead at any point to a specific part in the video, there is 10 chapters, including this first chapter of the course introduction. There's 10 chapters to this tutorial, this course. And if you're already accustomed with Vue 2 and you don't need to know the basics of Vue, you just want to get into like the composition API, there is timestamps on the side here or throughout the video timeline, there's timestamps and also in the description below as well. Let's just go over really quick what Vue even is to begin with. So Vue is a JavaScript front-end framework and it is in the leagues. It's pretty much it serves the same purpose as things you may have heard like React or Angular or even a new contender Svelte. And all of these serve the same purpose, which is to give you the tools and the framework to build your own front-end application. You can do really cool stuff with these frameworks that you wouldn't be able to normally do or you wouldn't be able to do easily with just vanilla JavaScript. There's obviously so much more we can go into about the specifics of what is Vue, but you're going to be learning a lot of it as we go through the tutorial, so I'm going to leave it there for now. And lastly, before we move on to the next step, which is setting up our actual project, I wanted to mention a few assumptions. First of all, I already have the assumption that you know what an IDE is or you have an IDE that you're already using. And lastly, and the most important assumption really, is that you have a basic understanding of HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. HTML and CSS is pretty core to it is the core of front end. We're not going to be wasting any time explaining how to use different HTML elements or CSS properties or anything like that. Awesome, time to get set up with our project. So to start off chapter 2, we're going to be creating a Git repository so we can save all of our code and make sure that we can revert any changes that we make. This is also going to be important for the final chapter, which is deploying our code to production. So if you haven't already got a GitHub account, go to github.com and sign up. It's super simple. And then go up into the top corner here and click on New Repository and you'll be taken to this page. Now, I'm going to create a new repository with you guys right now on camera. I've already got a Twitter repository, that's what you're going to say this already exists, that I used before this tutorial to run through everything to make sure this tutorial in the live recording is going to be as smooth as possible. So I'm going to call this Twitter, let's say tutorial. And you'll be able to find this repository in the description down below as well. You don't really need to worry about a description. I'm going to make this public so you guys can actually see it, but you can choose private to keep this, just to yourself so other people can't see it in your GitHub profile. We're going to ignore all of this right now, even the Git ignore. If you don't know much about Git, don't worry about it too much. A lot of our tutorial today is going to focus around utilizing tools that will do a lot of the boring stuff for us. So you don't need to worry too much about the specifics. Let's create this repository. And now we have this repository set up. You can go to this page, but it has no code yet. And so what we need to do is start adding our code to this repository. To get started with that, we want to do something called cloning. We want to clone our repository to our computer. We want to make sure that this Twitter tutorial project is on our computer. And to do that, we're going to be using a very simple tool called GitHub Desktop. Just go to desktop.github.com and it should automatically tell you for your operating system. I'm using Mac, obviously. It also has Windows versions. So just download the program and install it. I pretty much already have it installed, so I don't need to worry about that downloading. Once you've installed GitHub Desktop, open it up and sign into your GitHub account. Now you should be able to find your repository here. I've searched for it because I have a lot of repositories. Find the newly created repository you made for this tutorial, open it up and click clone. Now this is going to create a folder basically for that project on your computer. Now I have a specific folder here called Git. I think by default it goes to a GitHub folder in your documents, and I'm just going to clone this here. It'll take a second because there's pretty much no files in that repository yet. And now we have a folder on our computer that any new files added to it will be added to this repository once we commit them, and we'll go through the process soon. So the next step now is to open up your IDE and open up the project folder that we've just created. So I'm going to open up WebStorm. That's my IDE of choice. Remember, you can use VS Code, Atom, you can use any IDE you want. So you can see here now, I've opened my IDE and I've opened the project folder, so git/Twitter tutorial, basically the folder that we just created from the Git repository. Awesome, now we have our sort of development environment set up. But we are missing a few little tools that are very necessary to the development of our project. So the next step is going to involve you guys downloading Node.js. So all you need to do is download either version and install it, and you should be all good to go. It should be very straightforward and not difficult at all to install Node.js. And then it just sits there, and you really don't need to know or do anything with Node from now on. It sits there, and everything we're going to be building will pull from Node. It requires Node to run, but you don't actually need to interact with it specifically yourself. So now that we have Node installed, the final step is to set up a Vue project. And the way we're going to be doing that is utilizing a very strong and powerful Vue tool called the Vue CLI. So open up a terminal. If you don't know how to open up a terminal, all you need to do is typically most IDEs will have a terminal inbuilt that you can find and open up. Otherwise, search through your computer. If you're on a Mac, just search for the term terminal. And if you're on a Windows desktop, search for the CMD command prompt tool. And you should be able to get to a sort of command line interface. Now, don't worry. This is pretty much the most that we're going to be doing with a command line. Once we've installed the Vue CLI, everything can be done in a really easy to use web UI to control the rest of our sort of project. Now, what we're going to be doing is running npm install -g at Vue CLI. Now, I'm going to explain this really quickly. NPM is called Node Package Manager, or it stands for Node Package Manager, and that's automatically installed when we just installed Node.js. Install is pretty straightforward, and -g means globally. So instead of installing in this folder for this project, we're saying install it on our computer. And that's very important, specifically just for the Vue CLI. Most of the time, you won't be installing things globally. You'll be installing it specifically for your project. So we're going to run this. Okay, awesome. Now you've installed the Vue CLI globally on your device. Now, all we need to do from now on, this is the last command line thing we need to ever input, is going to be Vue UI. And that will start a web server enabling us to run and control our Vue project from a little web UI. So cool, you should be able to get to a point like this. I'm going to close some other tabs, and it should just be this blank slate Vue project manager. So what I want you to do is go to create and get to the folder that you've just created for your project. Mine is Twatter tutorial in the Git folder. Yours will likely be in documents /GitHub / whatever you named your project. And say create a new project here. And I'm gonna call it Twatter tutorial. Same as the folder. Package manager. So it doesn't really matter which package manager you use, but for the sake of this tutorial, let's just stick with npm. We're not gonna initialize a Git repository because we've already done that. And we're also going to say scaffold the project without the beginner instructions because we're following a tutorial as it is, so we don't need these extra beginner instructions. We're just going to say next, and this is very important. Now, depending on when you're watching this, this may look slightly different, but we want to make sure that whatever we're selecting Vue 3. Even in the future when Vue 3 is fully released, which could be like a week from now, honestly, it will still give you an option for Vue 2, I assume. I assume Vue 2 is still going to be available for a while. But make sure we're picking Vue 3. That's obviously the entire point of this video is to learn Vue with the latest Vue 3 version. So it's going to create the project for us. This is going to create a bunch of files. It's going to install a bunch of plugins for our project. It's going to do a lot of the work for us. And in doing so, it could take quite a while. So this could take, as it says down the bottom, this might take a while. It could take a few minutes. So let this run and you'll find that it creates a lot of files for you. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit to when this is finished creating. Awesome. Once finished, you should be able to get to this project dashboard page. It says welcome to your project. We can say understand. And it seems pretty empty. Don't worry about this kill port thing. You don't need to worry about any of that. What we're going to do straight away is jump to our tasks tab. Go to serve, and all of these here pretty much represent different scripts that we can run. And if we go to our project here, you can see that we have a Twatter tutorial folder inside our Twatter tutorial, so we'll fix that in a second. And then you can see it's created all of these files for us, which is awesome. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to remove I think I've accidentally done something wrong that you guys won't have to deal with, but I've accidentally got some other files in here. So this is what your project should look like. Your Git repository, and then another folder that we've created for Vue with a bunch of stuff in it. Now what we're going to do is if you're in this situation, I just move all my files into the root. There's no reason for it to be nested in another folder. And there is probably a proper way of doing this. I just end up all the time accidentally putting a folder within a folder, and then I fix it after the fact. So we're just going to remove this. For some reason, when I do that, it opens a bunch of files. So we're going to remove all of those. I'm just going to close everything if it allows me. We're going to remove this little folder, and we should be good. I don't know why. I think my IDE is not liking that I've closed everything so fast. So let me just open a file. Nope. Okay, cool. I'm going to restart my IDE and be right back. Awesome. So we are back. Everything's working again now. As you can see, like no matter how much you prepare, code will always do things. Technology will always have little bugs and little errors. So you just have to roll with those punches. Even doing a tutorial video, you can't get everything perfect. That's just the way it is. I've run the Vue UI web server again to get us back to here, but you'll see the project doesn't exist. Sometimes this can happen. All you got to do is pretty much re-import this folder, make sure it's selected, and there you go. You've got your Twitter tutorial folder. Now, we've got all of these files here. You don't need to worry. We're going to be going into the important stuff. Anything that's not mentioned in this tutorial, you don't need to worry too much about, but definitely feel free to explore this in your own time. It's always useful to learn by just exploring stuff. Cool. So if we go into our package.json, you can see there's 3 scripts here, and these align with the scripts that we can find here. Ignoring inspect, serve, build, and lint are basically just going to run these Vue CLI scripts. So what we're going to do is we're going to run serve, and this is basically just going to run this serve command in our package.json, but give us a cool UI that gives us a bit more stats about the speed and our dependencies, a little output sort of logging thing, and we now have a web server running. And if you go to output, you'll see it should be running on 8080. I think I have something else running on 8080 right now, so it automatically goes to the next port, which is 8081. If I click on that and open it up, this is our website. It is now live. It is now live as in it's locally live. It's on your computer. You can see localhost 8081. And so this is an actual website that is represented by this. This is your app.vue, and this is the first Vue file you're going to be working with, and it pretty much holds your entire application. And we're going to be going through a lot of detailed, awesome Vue stuff. But that is the end of chapter 2. You have a project now set up. Next chapter, we're going to be going into building single file components, which is really the core of Vue and most front-end libraries as well. So let's get cracked into it. Alrighty guys, chapter 3, building single file components. Now this is really the bread and butter of working with Vue. And I assume that potentially a few people watching this video, this is the chapter that they're instantly skipping to. Moving past the project setup, moving past the course introduction, straight into the code. So what we're going to be doing this chapter is really understanding how a single file component is built, the different the different parts of it, and how we can do really cool stuff with it, and actually writing some really interesting code. So first, let's look at one of these single file components and what a single file component actually means. So the reason we say single file component and how that's different in Vue compared to other libraries like React is in React, for instance, you might have your styles somewhere else, or in Angular, you might have your HTML somewhere else and a script, and everything is sort of split up a bit. And that's fine, but in Vue, we can do something really awesome called a single file component, which keeps everything in one file and split into different sections. So as you can see here, we have our template, which is basically our HTML. You can see our script here, which is our JavaScript, and our style, which is obviously our CSS and our stylings. Now, this is the automatically built for you app.vue file. Now, app.vue, this is a very important file. It pretty much sits in at the root of your source folder, and this holds your entire application. So just taking a look here at our template to start off with, we have an image, which is this image right here. And then we have this little tag, which if you guys are familiar with HTML, hello world is not a real HTML tag. So what's happening here? This tag represents a component. And you can see that we're importing this component file right here at the top of our script area, our script section. This is JavaScript being run here. So we're importing the component. and then we're putting the component inside this. So this export default is going to be all your Vue information. This is where you're keeping everything, anything related to Vue is going in here. And you may see different versions of this, but when you set up your Vue project with the Vue CLI, this is what it's going to look like. And you can see that this file here, we've named it app, and different components obviously have different names. And then we've got a components object here that has hello world. So what this file that we're importing has been put into the components object right here. Once you've imported the file and put it into your components within the Vue interface, this export default, then you can start referencing this in your template. And so we go import, put it in the components, put it into the template, and then this will render this entire component right here. This is all that one line of code is that entire hello world component. So let's go into it. Let's inspect it a little bit. We are going to go into this a little bit more, but this is a different file. You can find it in components, hello world, and all of this is being rendered now because of this one line that we've put in our app. And you can see it's got its own export default with its own name and a thing called props, which we're going to go into a little bit later on as well. It's got its own CSS going on, and it keeps everything concise. So a single file component is really good at keeping everything clean and keeping everything related to one component in the one space. And it makes everything super simple for you. So now you may be wondering, what is this other thing right here? What is this? We've got a template, I get that, but we have this property called message. Now, again, if you're very familiar with HTML, message is not a common property at all on any element. So what's going on here? This is what we call a prop. This is a prop called message, MSG, that we're passing in a string that is being handled in here. So you can see this message is actually what's being rendered in this H1 tag. And the way that's being handled is within this component, we have a little props section that is saying, hey, we expect a prop called message, and it's going to be a string. This is what we expect to happen. Now, if you want a prop that is not really, like, you can maybe put it in, but honestly, you don't need it. You can also add here, we can make the prop a little bit more detailed and say type string required. It's false. We don't really require it. If you want it, then we can have it there. Otherwise, it can just be null. It can be not entered whatsoever. So this message that we're putting in here, we're passing in this string to the prop, is what's being rendered up here. And so we can change this and say, hey, welcome to Twitter. And it updates here, and this is now changing stuff from the outside. We can pass data from the parent into the component really easily. And obviously that's something that's pretty unnecessary. Why would you do that when you can just put it in here? Well, because we might have data within the parent component that we want to pass into, and it allows you to do a lot more complicated stuff. And hopefully you're starting to see, oh, there's a lot of awesome things I can already do just understanding how to make a single file component and put some child components in there and put some props in there. There's already so much you can do. Now to move forward, what we're actually going to do is remove this hello world component. It's very interesting to look at, and it's very good to start a project. You take a look at it, but we're going to be building our own components. So I'm going to delete that. It's throwing me some errors because now I'm trying to import a file I've deleted, and we're going to remove this. I'm just going to have a very blank app file that's just the image. And you know what? Even then, let's remove the image. We are going to need something in this template, so I'm going to create a div. Let's just call it a div, and let's give it the ID of app. And that's it. So we've just got a blank slate. Blank slate. So what we're going to do first of all is we have to add a data section. And the data section of this sort of Vue interface, I'm going to continue to call this a Vue interface because it might have a real name, but I've never had to reference it in a tutorial or anything like that before. So we're going to call it the Vue interface. This works a little bit differently. Most keys within this interface here is going to be an object, or you can see it's just like a normal key, blah, 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 and then give it a value. But the data one works a little bit different. Data works as a function. So we say data and then put little brackets like it's a function, and then we return the data that we want to be used within our application. And this can be anything, and this can be reactive, and this changes. You can change this data throughout, but this is the data that is saved to the state of this component. So we're going to add two different data points within this function, within this return of this component. So first of all, we're going to be saying followers, and we're going to say 0. So because we're making a Twitter clone, followers is going to be a pretty useful data point to have. And really it's just to show off numbers, and we're going to be able to increase these followers in the future. So we have followers 0, and then we're going to add a user object. Now we're going to change this throughout the application because you typically won't be having, a user just in the state of your app. And we're going to be getting more and more advanced and moving things around a lot throughout the tutorial. But we're going to create a fake user object right here within the app data. So let's start off by saying ID is 1, just giving it some really basic fields. Username is going to be underscore Mitchell Romney. And for no reason other than that's my real Twitter handle, underscore Mitchell Romney. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. We're going to add some also basic user fields, like a first name, give it Mitchell, last name, which is Romney, pretty straightforward, an email, which is mitchellromney@theearthissquare.com, and one last, this one's a little bit more interesting. We're going to add an isAdmin flag, and we're going to say true. I'm going to use that a little bit later on. Now that we've added this data, what are we going to do? We should do something with it. We should represent it in some way. And so what we're going to do is add the username to our template. And that the way we reference that is using these little curly braces. Double curly braces is Vue's way of sort of interpolating. It's its way of saying, hey, this is going to be a dynamic data point. It's not just a string. We won't just say user.username, because that's just going to come up with literally it saying user.username. No, we want it to reference this variable that we've set down here. So if you've set it here in your data, you don't have to say data.user. You don't have to say, view.data.user or anything like that. If it's within here, it's automatically referenceable and reactive from your template just by using the key name. So we just user.username, save it, and you can see that we've got our username right here. And we can even add a little @ before it so it looks like a real Twitter handle. We have @Mitchell Romney, done and easy, okay? So that's how you add data to your application. Now, again, you probably won't be having a handwritten user object in your application. You might have something like is loading and then false, and then you're interacting with that to show the page loading or not. We're going to be getting into other real-world use cases of data throughout the tutorial. So the next thing that we can do with our data or different forms of data within a single file component is we're going to be exploring the idea of a computed property. Now, this is pretty common throughout all front-end frameworks. And a computed property, instead of just being one data point, it's more like a data point that is generated based off of other factors. So it's sort of built reactively on the spot based off of other things. So we're going to go computed. And we're going to create a computed property called full name. Now, you could probably guess what this actually does. We're going to return, and we're going to build what this value should be in sort of a function-like format. So we can just say, I'm going to use these string literals, the JavaScript string literals, and say this. So I'm going to explain this in a second. We'll go first name. So whenever throughout our computed, and we're going to be making methods after this, whenever we want to reference this data that's sitting here, we use this. And if we're going to create some functions, some methods as well. And if you want to reference those, you say this dot and the method name. So this is a way for us to reference everything within sort of our Vue interface. So this dot user, which is the data point that we've put here, dot first name, which is just a key within our user object. So that gives us the first name, but we don't want just the first name. We want to generate a full name. So we just do the same thing, and we just say this.user.last name. And you can see here, we've put a little space between them. So this here is called a string literal. You can also do something like this.user dot first name plus a space plus this.user dot last name. I've misspelt first name here. So you can also do something like this. I'm just a fan of using string literals just because it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to plus together. Like in that example I just showed you, I had to plus a little space just to put a space between the words. This is a lot easier. And now what we can do is we can actually just reference full name, because that's the name of our computed property here. And if we go back to this page, you say my username and then my full name. And this is just generated on the spot, computed on the spot. Now what we can do is we can say my name is actually Mitch, and we're going to say Rooney, and that changes automatically. That data point is computed based off of whatever you return here. And so that can be really, really interesting, and that's very powerful. You can do a lot of awesome stuff with that. So that's the basics of making a computer property. Again, we're going to be getting into more and more advanced stuff as the tutorial goes on. But that's the basics of creating a computer property inside your single file component. Next up, let's get some really fun stuff and create some functions or some methods that we can use throughout our component. So we're going to create a little key here called methods. And we're going to define a method called follow user. And all we're going to do is say this.followers plus plus. And that's basically the same. If you guys are familiar with JavaScript, it's the same as saying this.followers equals this.followers plus 1, or also the same as this.followers plus equals 1. All these three do the same thing, which is just increment that value by 1. But the easiest way for us to write it is just to say the value plus plus is the easiest way to do that. And now we need a way to trigger this method. This method doesn't just run by itself. We need something to trigger the method. So first of all, we want to list, let's put a little strong tag here and say followers. And we want to put the number of followers here. Right, so on our page, we say followers 0. And I actually want to, let's get rid of a few things here in the styling as well. Remove the text align, remove the margin at the top. And can we just say display flex and flex direction column? Is that going to actually, yes, okay, cool. Maybe we put things in the middle again. Justifying content center, is that going to do the thing I wanted to do? No. Let's just text align center again. Oh, I missed that. Okay, cool. So we have our Twitter handle with our Twitter name, and we have followers, and then we have our follower count. And one last thing we want to add here now is a way to trigger that function to run and to increase our follower count when it's pressed. So we're going to do a button that just says follow. All right. Oh, what about if I could spell follow? That would be really useful to the tutorial. So now, okay, ignore the styling. The styling doesn't really matter. We're serving a purpose here. So, and you can see, okay, I'm pressing the button, but nothing's happening because we haven't actually told this button. It's just a button right now. It hasn't been told to do anything. And so the way we make it, we tell it to do something when clicked is we say @ which is also another way of saying v on, v dash on, and then whatever we're trying to, we can say click. So v on click is telling us, hey, let's do a thing on click. I'm going to say follow user. But it's much nicer, in my mind at least, to say @click. The @ sign in this instance is pretty much interchangeable with a v dash on. So you can do @click equals, and then the thing we want to happen. And the thing we want to happen is we want it to run this method follow user. So let's save that. And now when we press the button, you can see the follower number goes up, and we can just keep pressing it. And if we refresh the page, it goes back down to 0 because that's the default state of our follower sort of data point that just gets reset to 0. And if we keep pressing this button, we can increase it. So now you can see how we can create a method that interacts with our data and how that data is reactively changing in our template, which is really, really awesome, very powerful stuff. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at within our sort of Vue setup here is lifecycle hooks, something called lifecycle hooks. Now, a lifecycle hook is basically a function built into the Vue interface that runs during different stages of the component's lifecycle. So for instance, you have a hook called mounted, which we're going to be using in a second. You also have things like created, destroyed, stuff like that. So you can get an idea of like when the component is destroyed, for instance, that's the term, when it's basically just removed, it will run the function that the lifecycle hook destroyed. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up the lifecycle hook of mounted. And this is going to run whenever the component is loaded for the first time. And if you unmount it and then remount it, it will be running again. So this is going to run basically for the instance of this tutorial. Mounted is going to run when we first load the component. So we're just going to say this.follow user, right? Really easy. It's a method that we've already just set up, and all we're saying is when you mount this component, run this function, and this function, all that's inside this function is run this other function, basically. And you can say also console log whatever. You can do a bunch of logic in here. You don't have to just run a function, but for the sake of this, all we're saying is run this mounted function, which then runs this follow user function method that we've defined here. So now you'll find it's automatically set to 1. And if we refresh the page, I'm refreshing right now. Let's follow it a few times, refresh again. It's reset to 1, even though the follower point, data point is set to 0, because the second that we start up our component, the second it's first mounted, it's running this function and it's running this other function to increase it by 1. Oh. And that's happening in a split second. That's in 1 millisecond, it's running this, which runs this, which is setting our data point to 1 instantly. And obviously you can do a lot more cool stuff like that. You can on-mount, let's say you need to get a user object from your API. You can make an API call in your mounted thing and then set the user here. There's a lot of interesting stuff. So whenever the component is first rendered, run everything within here. That's a lifecycle hook. And as I mentioned, there's other ones like, I think it was unmounted, which I don't use that much. You've got destroyed, you've got created. Created is technically right before mounted. And I think when we start getting into the composition API, I'm pretty sure created and mounted nearly become the same thing, or it changes a little bit in that instance. But yeah, if you want to look more into lifecycle hooks and the different kinds of lifecycle hooks, definitely give that one a Google and look at the Vue docs. They're very in-depth. The last thing we're going to be looking at in our single file components chapter here is something called watch. And I'm going to actually add it up here. I have a really just like my own order of what I should put data and watch and computed and methods and lifecycle hooks. You can really put this in any order. It doesn't matter. But yeah, we're going to be doing something called watch. And watch watches, as the name sort of says, it watches a data point, and when it changes, you can run a function. Now that's really useful. Sometimes you actually have data that changes reactively based off of other things. Maybe you have a WebSocket open that says, hey, change the user information every time you get something from the backend that says like, hey, you've got a new follower. Add a notification, then you watch the notifications, and you can do a bunch of really cool stuff. So without getting too complicated, we're going to add a little watch function here that watches followers. So the easiest way to do this is just to name, you want to name this the same thing that you're trying to follow, or to watch, sorry. So if we wanted to watch, you can also watch computed properties. We could name this full name as well. So when full name changes, we do some stuff. So we're going to watch followers though, and we're going to give it two, it gets 2 different data points in here. We're going to say new follower count and old follower count. Now you can name these obviously whatever you want, but basically the gist of it is when the data changes, you're going to get past 2 variables. You're going to get past what the data is now and what it used to be, what it changed from, which is really, really useful because sometimes you only want, like if I changed this user and I changed his email, but I only want to run something when his when this changes, when the isAdmin flag changes, we want to put a condition in here. Hey, if the old email is different from the new email, then run something. Or if the old isAdmin field is different from the new isAdmin field, do something. So it's really useful to compare the old and the new because sometimes things change and it's actually completely fine and you don't want anything to run. You want to know what's actually changed. So what we're going to do is add a little condition here that says old follower count. If that's less than the new follower count, all right, because maybe we lose a follower and maybe we don't want to do something in that instance. And for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to say console log, and we're going to reference this.user.username has gained a follower. Exclamation mark. So now what this is going to do is if this user gains a follower, we're going to run this command. We're going to run console log if they've gained a follower, not if they've lost one, only if they've gained one. So now if I inspect this and I go to my console, you can see it's already console logged the, I'm going to just close this. It already says Mitchell Romney has gained a follower because remember on the second the component is being loaded, we're running this mounted hook, which is following you instantly. But if I run this again a bunch of times, you can see it's run 5 times. It sort of merges it, it bundles it all together. But you can see Mitchell Romney has gained a follower. It's run 5 times. So every time we gain a follower, it's logging that. And yeah, you can do a lot of really awesome stuff with that. Sometimes you want to watch the route. So a really interesting use case for me, at least in my past, has been I have a component that's built to look at, let's say, a user. And if we go to a different user from that page, technically the component stays the same. We're not changing components. It's the same user profile component, but now we have different data going into it. And so you may want to watch, hey, has the user changed? If the user has changed, or if the user ID in the URL has changed, which gets a little bit more complicated, then we want to fetch new user data. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff you can do with watch, but that's pretty much how you start watching different pieces, different data points within your component, and run some code when that happens. So that's pretty much the end of this chapter. It gives you the basics of creating data, watches, computed properties, methods, and mounted and lifecycle hooks in a single file component. The next chapter, we're going to be moving in, how do we start doing some really awesome stuff, some more awesome stuff in our template with all of this data. So let's get right into it. Chapter 4, template, conditionals, loops, and events. Before we get started into the nitty gritty of all those different concepts, I've done a little bit of refactoring, and it's going to be common throughout different chapters of this tutorial. I'm going to make some changes off camera just to make things a little bit clearer. It's not going to be implementing things that I either haven't already taught or that aren't really related to this tutorial. So it's just to clean things up and make it a little bit easier for you. So you can see I've added some more specificity to the classes. I've actually turned everything that we put into the app into its own component, something we went over right at the beginning, which was creating components. I created this new file, user profile in the components. I imported it, put it into the components here, and then we moved all of our logic to this one component here, which makes it a lot neater for us. I've also added a few CSS stylings. As I said, I'm not going to be going into the styling of everything, but this is what it looks like now. So we now have this little user panel up in the top left. It has a follow account and it has the user's name, and that's pretty much it. So what we're going to be going into today, as the chapter sort of suggests, is template conditionals. So if this, then represent this, otherwise show this, or, conditionally representing different parts in our template. Looping data. So if we have a list of things, how do we represent a list of different components in our template? And then also events. So we sort of touched on events a little bit by having a button that we could click. A click is an event. So going over a little bit more specifically going over events and stuff like that. So the first thing we want to do is really simple, right? Adding something if a condition is true. This is a very core part to pretty much all programming. Is the condition is if this, then do this. So what we're going to be doing is adding a user admin badge if the user is an admin. Now remember, we added this is admin flag here. So if this is true, we want a little badge somewhere in this user panel that says admin. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add, maybe let's say under the username, let's say user profile. The class doesn't really matter. The class is just personal preference, naming preferences. You can name it whatever you want. And I'm going to call it admin badge. Let's just call it admin badge. And it's just going to say admin, right? So we have this little thing here. Maybe let's give it a little bit of styling. Let's add a little class here that's like user profile, admin badge. We'll say background is like red and color is white, so we can actually see it. Let's give it a little border radius, something like that, of like 5 pixels. That should probably be good. We got a little admin thing there. Let's also just say margin right is auto, so it's not just taking up the entire page. Let's also give it some padding. There you go. So we've got a little admin thing. Let's also maybe make it bold. And I really don't like the red. It's so harsh. Let's just give it a weird Rebecca purple. Sure, that works. So we have this little admin badge. But if I say this user is not admin, and so remember this user object here is something you'd probably get back from an API. And so we're saying they're not an admin, but we're representing them as an admin. So how do we make that conditional based off of this one data point? And so all we have to do is start utilizing a property called VIF. VIF, super simple. VIF, and then we say equals user dot is admin. We want to say VIF equals, and then the condition, right? The thing we want to condition. We can also say if followers, I've got too many things. If followers is more than 10, then show this thing. But right now we're just working on a single Boolean that says user is admin. So we only want to show this, and it's this right here. So whatever we're putting this on, everything within here is going to be shown or not shown depending on this condition. We save it, now you can see it's gone. The badge is gone. And if we say is admin is true, it returns. And if we say v-if, and if you guys aren't super familiar with JavaScript or programming in general, this little exclamation mark before a Boolean field, before a true or false field, is basically the opposite. Do the opposite, right? V-if it isn't true is what we're saying here. Then it's going to disappear again. But then if we set is admin to false, if it isn't this, then well, we're starting to get into double negatives at this point. But is admin is false. So we want to set this back to here. So we do want to show it if the user is an admin. We're going to set the admin to true. And so we have the admin badge there if the user is an admin. Very straightforward and very powerful. Very cool stuff. And that's pretty simple. If you want to get into, I don't know, we can pretty much copy and paste this. You can also do v else, right? So we can say v if this, else do this, right? Not admin. and then if we say is admin is false, this is pretty pointless to have a badge that says not admin, but there you go, it says not admin. And you can also do v else if, and so it becomes very much like normal programming JavaScript code is if this, else if this, else if this, else this. And so you can kind of just have a list of different things that happen in order. We're just going to keep this. It's pretty straightforward. V if this, then show this this template. All right, this HTML tag. Cool. The next thing we're going to get into is loops. How do we start looping and representing lists of data? Now, this is really, really important and gives us a lot of really more cool stuff that we can do. So what we're going to do to start messing around with a list is one of the most obvious things we can do in a Twitter clone, which is to have a list of tweets. So what we're going to do here is I've already set up the CSS a little bit. So we have this user panel here. Next to the user panel, I want to add user profile, and let's call it tweets. Sorry, these are going to be tweets. They're not tweets, they're tweets. Tweets wrapper. All right. And inside this block, we want to have a list of all the different tweets. So what we're going to do here is on the user, we're going to add a new field. And we're going to say tweets. And this is going to be an array of different tweets or tweets from this user. And each of these tweets is represented by an object. And we just give that object some values. So let's first of all give it an ID. Most objects have an ID. Next, we're going to say, who's the user that made this tweet, right? And we're going to say this user is, oh no, actually, you know what? We probably don't need to do that. Because this is a tweets list on this user object, it's pretty fair to say that each of these tweets is made by this person. But we are going to say one of the most important things was what's the content of the tweet? What are they actually saying? What is the thing that they're tweeting out there? And we're going to say, Twitter is amazing. Exclamation mark, there you go, content. And we're gonna make another tweet and we're gonna call this one ID2 in the content. I'm gonna use double quotes here because I'm gonna be using a single quote in there. Don't forget to subscribe to the Earth is Square. Cool, so now we have a list of 2 different tweets. They're saying 2 different things with 2 different IDs. How do we represent these without just saying, I mean, yes, technically we could go tweet, index of 0, user.tweets 0, and then we could say user.tweets 1, but that is also very annoying. It's not a very programmy way of doing things. And also if you start getting to the point where you have hundreds of things in a list, this is not going to be very scalable either. So the way that we're going to do this is similar to how we did v-if. We have a v-for, which is super awesome. So what we're going to do is create div class, and we're going to say user profile. Obviously, again, you can name your classes whatever you want. This is just my way of doing things. And we're going to say tweet. This is going to represent an individual tweet, an individual object, just one of these. And then we're going to say v-for tweet in user.tweets. So we're saying this is what we want to call each individual object in that list. We're going to reference this and basically give it the variable of tweet in, and then you reference the list that we're trying to pull from. So user.tweets is what we're referencing. And so what this is doing is render this block for each object in this list. So not what's inside of this. This whole object is going, or sorry, this whole tag, this user profile tweet section here, this whole thing is going to render not just the children inside of it, but the parent itself. So this is each individual object is going to be this tweet thing. And we're just going to say, now inside of this, inside the child, we can represent tweet by itself and just say content, right? And if we go back to our, and this is going to be a common error. It's something I constantly forget because you don't really think about it sometimes. Sometimes you get this error, elements and iteration, expect to have v-bind key directives. Ugh, that just sounds like a bunch of nonsense. What does that even mean? What's the point of it? It's basically just saying when we're doing things in a list, we need to have an ID for that thing. I mean, it's not really that important when you're doing very basic stuff like this, but it starts to become more important down the line when you start doing more and more complicated things. Vue needs to know sort of an identifier for each object in this list. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give it the ID. The easiest thing to do most of the time is give it an ID. If you're representing a list of things that don't have IDs or it doesn't make sense for them to have an ID, what you can also do is put that in brackets and say index here. And so this then becomes, this is the object, and this is the basically the index of that object in the list, which is always pretty much going to be unique from everything else. So this is going to be index of 0, this is going to be index of 1, and so on. So that's also useful to use if you just need to fill something into the key that's going to be unique for each object. So we'll give it tweet, the key of tweet.id, and now you can see we have both of our tweets sitting here, first one, second one. We can add as many different things we want to this list, and it will render them all out one after another. And if we inspect this, actually you can see the code that's being generated. So you can see our tweets wrapper that's holding all the tweets, and then each individual object here, we've only written this sort of template here. We've only written this once. Oh no, I'm moving it out. We've only written this once, but it's being rendered twice because we're looping through the list and creating that template for each thing. Now, if that list was empty, nothing would actually render. You're saying for each object in an empty list, render the thing. Okay, well, if there's nothing in it, we're not going to render anything. So that is the basics of how to loop through a list and render it on your page. Again, I'm going to say this for pretty much everything, but very powerful. This is why people use front-end frameworks, is because you can do really, really cool stuff. Like each new thing, when I was learning this for the first time, each new thing I learned just opened up a world of possibilities. Oh, I can represent a list of users and objects and all of these different things. It becomes very, very powerful and very, very fun to use and just explore and see what you can do. But yes, that's the end of loops. The last thing we're going to start to look at is events. So events are things that happen when you're interacting with the web page. So events are pretty specific to the template. If you're interacting with something on the screen, it will trigger an event in some capacity. So a very common one, I'd say the most common event, is the click event. When you click on a button, when you click on a link, when you click on, just a word, right? You can trigger an event called click, and that can run a function on that click, which I'm sure you can imagine the possibilities for clicking something and having a function run. That's quite important to websites and web apps. So what we're going to do to go further into this and to clean up our code a little bit is we're going to change this tweet object that we're sort of looping over. We're going to change this into its own component, because doesn't it make sense for a sort of a tweet object, a tweet panel sort of thing to be its own component that we can reference throughout the website? That makes sense to me. So I'm going to create this component and then show you guys what it looks like, and we will move forward. Alrighty, awesome. Let's take a look at the quick refactorings that I've done just to clean things up a little bit so you guys aren't too lost at where we are. And then we'll quickly look into adding a custom event to allow us to toggle whether or not we favorite a tweet or not. So really quick, we had our user profile component. And what I've done is I've created a tweet item component and pretty much left the same v4 on it. So we do want to loop and create a tweet item component for each tweet in the list. We give it the same key. And the only difference is we're passing in a couple of props now that we mentioned right at the beginning of the tutorial. We're passing in a couple of props. So right now we're passing in a username and passing in the actual tweet object. This is being pulled from this over here. Cool, so within this component that I've created, you can see it over here in our file structure. Might even make this a little bit less. We've defined these two props. So username is a string that we do require, and the tweet is a object that we do require. We can't render this tweet component without this information. And then I've just built out the component a little bit here, laid out a few more tags with some CSS with it, and this is what it looks like in the component. So it's pretty similar, but now we have our tweets in their own little panels. We have the username and the content of the tweet. And we also have, I've added just a little hover effect just because I like doing things like that. A little hover effect, if you want to see how that's done, it's basically just on hover transform with the transition. Pretty straightforward. Oh, and also change the cursor to pointer. Anything that feels like it changes when you hover over it should have a pointer cursor. It's just good sort of user experience in UI. So awesome. So this is pretty much where we are. It's pretty much the same, except we've just cleaned it up a little bit. Now we want to be able to favorite this tweet item. And we're going to be learning something new with this as well called emit, which is basically passing data. We've passed data from our parent to our child using props, but now we want to pass data from our child back up to our parent. And the way we do that is we want to add on the item, we want to add a little click event, which we did before with the button. And we want to say favorite a tweet, and we want to make sure that we get the tweet ID in this favorite. And obviously it's saying, hey, this is not something we know. So we've got to make sure, like we learned before, we've got to add some methods. And we want to add the favorite tweet method with an ID. And so this is where we get to do something really cool. We get to say this, referencing Vue basically, $ emit. So this is like a built-in piece of functionality, $ emit. And this will change a bit when we get into the sort of composition API, but using this sort of Vue layout, we're doing this $emit. We're saying, what is the event that we're emitting? So right now, this is similar to this @click event, but that's sort of built into HTML and browsers and stuff like that. So right now, we're sort of emitting our own custom event, like click, but we've got to name it something. So we're going to say we're emitting a favorite event, and we're just going to release up or sort of send up the ID of the tweet that we're favoriting. Now from the parent, right, where we're referencing this component, we can now do @favorite, sort of like we're doing @click, because favorite is now an event that we are emitting up to the parent. And we get that ID, and we just want to say, hey, toggle favorite, right? Now it's not a function yet. Let's create a function, a little method here called toggle favorite, and we know we're passing an ID in. And then all we want to do is, for the sake of this tutorial, we can just say console.log favorited. Whoop. I'm Australian, by the way, so it's favorited with a U. Tweet and hashtag, and we'll just say, let's get this a little bit more interesting. And we're just going to say favorited tweet with the ID of whatever ID is being passed up. That's awesome. Okay, so now let's open our console. We'll see we've got the other console logs from gaining a follower. And if I click this, it's going to say favorited tweet number 2, favorited 1, favorited 2, favorited 1. And you can see it going back and forth. And so this is the sort of thing, instead of, console logging, which you wouldn't really do in a normal application, instead you could run a function here that says to the API, hey, I've favorited this tweet. And if you click it again, you can run the same thing. And that's why I said toggle, because instead of saying, hey, set favorite yes or set favorite no, we can toggle it and basically say to the API, hey, we're toggling this. We should know here, I guess. Do we already favorite this? Okay, well, he's clicked it, so he's probably trying to unfavorite it. Oh, it's not favorited? Okay, we are trying to favorite it. And so that's why we're saying toggle. So whenever you click this, we run this function. We can send that to an API or something to say, hey, favorite this tweet. And that's events. We've already done events with like a normal inbuilt event like click. And here we are building a sort of custom event called favorite that passes data up from the child to the parent. And the parent's saying, hey, whenever this is emitted, right, the favorite event, whenever that's emitted from the child, run this function. And so really straightforward. Hopefully you guys see the amount of possibilities there. One last thing we're going to do quickly. I mean, I could probably do this off camera. I'm just going to refactor this a little bit because it's starting to get a little bit too long. You're going to start to notice that some things that are packed full of features, you start to have to reference them a little bit more like this, just because we don't want the line to go on and on and on forever. We got to start spacing things out and making things a little bit clearer. So you're going to find a lot of densely packed objects, like a tweet item is going to have a lot of different things, a lot of different attributes on it, and so we do something like this. Anyway, the next chapter that we're moving on to is forms and handling user input, so let's get cracked into that. Alrighty, chapter 5, forms and handling user input. Now, this is obviously a very important one. This is something that I'm sure a lot of you really want to learn how to do. Obviously, if you've just skipped straight to this chapter, it's something quite important to you. But this is, a core part of websites is people being able to enter in their own information, such as like a login page, or, in this instance, we're going to be creating a new tweet panel to enable us to write in a tweet or a tweet and have it written onto the page. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to write your own tweet, submit it, and then it render in the list of all of our tweets here. So what we're going to do is on the user profile component, where we have, so I'm just going to minimize this right here. So we have our follow account, which is something here. And under our follow account, we want to add a form actually. So you typically want to have all of your user input stuff inside of a form. It's just good convention. With normal HTML, there's a very specific reason. We sort of start to break some of the HTML, inbuilt HTML form handling stuff. Because if you guys know, if you submit a normal HTML form, it'll refresh the page to submit that form. And we don't want that to happen. So we're going to start to force some things to act differently, but we're still going to put it within a form. So we're going to say form, we'll give it a normal class like we normally do. Again, you just can do whatever class you want. I'm going to say create tweet is going to be the form. We're going to give it a label because make sure you always give your input fields labels. It's very important. And we're also going to give it just strong, just so I don't have to give it a styling properly. And we're going to say new tweet. So that's the label for it, is new tweet. And we're going to make a text area. We don't want just a normal input field. We want a text area because we're writing potentially up to 180 characters is what we're aiming for. We'll give it the same ID that we gave the label as well. This is all just normal HTML stuff, so I'm sort of rushing through it a little bit. We'll give it 4 rows, so the text area is also a little bit big as well. So if we save that and come back here, we've got our new tweet input field. It looks kind of gross, so what we're gonna do, we'll add a little bit of styling just so it at least displays a little bit differently and sits on top of each other and not next to each other. So there you go. So now you've got new tweet. Maybe we'll even add like a, let's add a border on the top or something of 1 pixel solid, and we'll just say black for now. It doesn't need to look too crazy. Give some padding on the top as well. We'll give it there. Actually, what's our border over here? We'll give it the same color as this. Looks a little bit nicer. See, I'm a front-end developer by profession, so I start thinking about how can I make everything look as nice as possible. Even under the badge, let's give this some margin at the bottom of the same. What do we give it, 10 or 20? 20. Oh, that's not what I wanted, actually. Oh, we just leave it like that. That's fine. Now I want to get rid of the border. The padding at the top is enough. So we have a new tweet that we want to enter. And also what we want to do to start we want to experiment. I want to show you guys how to do more than just an input field. And so we're using text area here, but input would work exactly the same. We also want to add something a little bit more interesting and a little bit more dynamic. And we're going to be adding a drop down that utilizes the tools that we learned before for looping through different objects and creating things based off of lists. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating, let's see here, we'll create a user profile and we're going to call it create tweet type. So we're going to have 2 different types of tweets that we can create, a draft and a real instant tweet. So again, we want to add a little bit of a label here for new tweet type. And again, strong. Oh. And we want this to just say type. Pretty straightforward. Then we're going to be creating a select field. And if you're familiar with HTML, which hopefully you are, you know how a select field, in a very basic way, how it works. So that's, you know, another input sort of field, select. And then this is inside the select is where we put different options. And so we could just write out a bunch of different options. But because we're programmers and because we're using Vue and we want to be a little bit cool, we can loop through the same way that we've looped through twoots before. We can start looping through options in the same way. So let's build an option tag. This is a normal HTML tag. We're going to say the value is option.value. Now, really quick, I don't know if I addressed this before and I don't know if it's come up, and I'm sorry if I've missed it. This right here, what is this? What are we doing with this little colon here? If you remove this, you can see here my IDE even represents it. This becomes just a normal string. The value of this option becomes literally the words option.value. And so when you, in Vue, if you put a little colon before the attribute, this now becomes referencing, like you're referencing variables. You're referencing, yeah, it's actually, it's variables. You're referencing code. You're not referencing a string or a piece of text. You're trying to reference some other piece of code. So keep that in mind. You can put this with anything. Like I could make ID, just put a colon there, and then this will reference that. And I can do user.username or something like that. And that would reference that string. So yeah, keep that in mind. Very simple, very easy. And once you get used to it, as you can see, sometimes I don't even think about it. Cool. So then what we want to do here is do a little bit of looping. So before we do some looping, we need some options to loop. So let's create over here in our data, let's create a little list and we'll call it twoot types, right? Make it an array. And we'll say, we'll make each type an object and we'll say it'll have two values, right? We'll have value, which is like the raw value of it, right? And if we want draft and instant, we're just gonna call value is draft. And let's say the name, right, is gonna be what the person actually sees the option's name to be, which will say draft, and we'll call it the same, it was capitalized, right? And over here, we'll do the same thing, value, and we'll say instant, right? Oh, make that a string, instant. And for the second one, we just want to say like instant twoot, just to show you that these are two different values here. Cool, so you can see up here, we're doing option.value. So let's figure out what option even is. So let's say v4 option in twoot types. Whoop, that's actually lowercase. Twoot types. Remember, we need a key. So this is where, let's just show off the index thing that I mentioned previously, and the key is just going to be the index. Alrighty, so what we've done here with this is we've created an option tag, option element, HTML element. We've given the value of that option, it's dynamic. The value of that option depends on the option that we're currently iterating in through this list. So each object, or each option in this list, which is these two things we've referenced down here, have a value field, and that's what becomes the value of this HTML tag option. And we want to give it something that people can actually recognize. So within this option tag, we give it a name, give it a label of some sort, and we can just say option.name. So if I save that and go back to here, you can now see we have type and a drop down, and this drop down has both different options. Now, you may be wondering, if I'm writing in hello or whatever, how do I actually access this? Or how do I access what the type has been selected here? This is just sort of, this isn't doing anything. It's not being saved anywhere. I can't reference it in my code. What do I do? And so this is where we get to the core of how to handle forms and input fields with Vue is a tag or an attribute, HTML attribute called v model. So similar to how we have v_if and v_for, we're using something called v model. And that basically says whatever the value of this field is equal to and should sync up with a data point that we're referencing within our sort of Vue interface. So let's get the first one, this text area. Actually, let's build the data points first. So let's say the twoot. No, let's say new twoot content is a string, and we'll just say it's empty string, right? And we'll also say selected twoot type is also an empty string, right? Actually, no, because we should have a default, right? So we'll say instant. The selected tweet type default is instant, but the tweet content should be empty. The actual text box should be empty. So with this text area, we just say v-model equals new tweet content. And so the value of this field is synced up with the value of this text area. And so when I'm typing in hello, exclamation mark, you can't see it yet, and we'll get into it, but this string here, whatever I'm entering in this text box, is being synced up and saved to this data value. So new tweet content currently equals this hello gibberish text. We'll do the same thing with the select field as well. We'll just say v-model equals tweet, selected tweet type. Save that. And so you can see the type instantly changed to instant tweet because that's the default value of that field. And if we change this to draft, now this field, this selected tweet type data point, has actually changed to this draft value that we're setting here in the options value. When we selected that draft sort of drop down option, it set this value here as the value in this selected tweet type. And so we can start referencing that later on. Now to see everything come together, the last step here is to submit the tweet, right? Every form has a submit sort of button, really. It should anyway. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a button, and a form already knows what to do with a button, so we can just leave it as is, and we can just say tweet. And now, before we move on, if I press this button, it's going to, I don't know if you guys could see there, but it actually sort of refreshes the page. That's how HTML forms work. When you submit a form, and with HTML, a button automatically is sort of registered when clicked to submit. When you submit a form, it refreshes the page, and we don't want that at all. That's not how a single page application will work. And so what we do is we sort of use an event, but we sort of change it a little bit. So submit is the event on the form that's being run, but what we want to do is say prevent, and instead we want to say, hey, run something else. Instead of running your normal like refresh page HTML submit event, we want to prevent it with a different function that we're going to say. So create new tweet is what the actual function, what the actual thing we want to run. Down here in methods, you can see my component is already getting messy. This is why you want to break things down into smaller and smaller components. And I'll do that off camera, probably in the next chapter or two. But we're going to say create new tweet. This is the function, again, that we want to run when we press that button. And this is where we can start pulling in these data points up here that we have created. So what we're going to say in this method is we're going to say, first of all, we want to question, is there even content? We don't want to do anything if there's no content that has been written yet. If you accidentally press the button, it shouldn't do anything. So we're going to say this dot new tweet content. And also, if this dot new tweet wait, what did we call it? Selected tweet type, that's right. Tweet type doesn't equal draft, right? We don't want to submit it if it's just a draft. And you'd obviously do more stuff in the future. If it is a draft, then put it into your drafts folder or something like that. But right now, we just want to say, if it is a draft, don't do anything, right? Just to reference the field. And then what we want to do is say this.user, right? We want to add now a new tweet. So we have tweets here. We want to add a new one with the values that with the text that we've put into the new tweet content. So what we're going to say is this.user.tweets. That's the list of tweets that we want to add to. We're going to say unshift, right? That's JavaScript for basically put this at the start of the list. You could also say push, but push will put it to the end of the list. We want to put this at the start of the list. And we want to give it an ID. Now, how do we give it an ID in a way that is incremental? It's going to give us new IDs every single time, basically. And what we're going to do for the sake of this tutorial is say this.user.tweets, right? That's the list. .length, right? +1. So right now, tweets, the first tweet ID is ID of 1. This is ID of 2. If we added a new one, it would get the length of this, of the tweets list, which is the length is 2, and then +1. So we just give it an ID of 3. And then the next one we submit, we get an ID of 4 and 5 and 6. And that's a really easy way, very simple way. It's not necessarily 100% foolproof because sometimes IDs won't match up with the length of the list. But for the sake of this tutorial, that will give us a dynamic ID. Most of the time, IDs are handled on the back end with a database. So we're just mocking this data for now. The content is where we get more interesting. We're going to say this and the value that we've sort of synced up the content with, which is new tweet content. This.new tweet content. And then also because, oh, actually no. And then that's it. We give it an ID and we give it the content. That's it. Save that. Now let's try and create a new tweet, see what happens. Hello. Make sure its type is instant tweet and tweet it out. And there we go. It's added to our page instantly. It's reactive. It was added to the list of tweets on the user, which is automatically rendered on the page. We could also say, don't forget to like the video and change this to a draft, right? And tweet, wait a minute, it's not working. Remember, we set that condition to say, hey, don't do anything if the type is a draft. So you can see how this option here is being read by the function and saying, oh, it's a draft, we don't want anything to do with it. Go back to instant tweet that one out, and gets added to the page. Ignoring that when we add new things to the page, it's sort of extending. This is all CSS stuff I'll probably clean up later. Yeah, one last thing we could probably do just to add a little bit more to it is if we are submitting that tweet, then we want to say this.new tweet content equals nothing. We want to make sure that the box gets emptied when we submit a new tweet. So let's say hello again, tweet it, and now the box is empty. It's added to the list and the box has now become empty like we've just created a new tweet. In a real world application, you would send that to the back end, you'd send it to your API, you would save it to a database. But this is obviously a very, very simple way you can see how all of this works and how it all interconnects. And I so very much recommend you exploring this and just creating new things and try new stuff. And if you have ideas, just give it a shot and see how you go. But yeah, that's the end of forms and input values. You can see it's really quite simple and straightforward. If you have any questions, don't forget to leave it in the comments. But the next chapter we're moving on to is all about styling and CSS, and we start to experiment with better ways of writing our CSS and how to apply stylings globally. So let's get into it. Alrighty guys, chapter 6 is dynamic styling, SCSS, and global styling. So let's start off quickly with what is SCSS. So SCSS is basically a different way of writing CSS. It uses a library. It uses something you have to install. This is not a normal CSS thing. This is a different way of writing CSS that then gets compiled using something like Webpack into normal CSS that the browser is used to and will read. And the main reason, there's actually a few different reasons we could use SCSS, but the main reason I like to use it is because I really enjoy being able to write my CSS with nested classes. So nesting basically means that knowing that this, the sort of HTML element that has this class is within the user profile, what we could do is move that into here and nest each thing, nest each class in other classes. That achieves two things. One, for me at least, it makes CSS clearer to read. I can see the hierarchy of different classes and different elements. The second thing it does is it makes all of our CSS classes even more specific. And I'm going to show you what that means in a second. So let's first of all, and before we move forward, there's one last thing I want to show you. It's quite important and very specific to Vue. In our single file components, we have this thing called style, and we can add a little attribute here called scoped. And I pretty much add this to every single one of my components, except for the root app component. I would say leave it off there because that causes problems. Other than that, you want to scope all of your CSS to the component. And what this does, it means every single class that you write in here is only going to be applied to this component. Now, user profile admin badge, maybe that doesn't apply. You're never going to use that class anywhere else, so it's not really that much of an issue. But maybe H1, maybe when you're adding styles to H1, you're going to be using some more H1 tags throughout your application, and maybe you don't want to remove the margin on that H1 tag. Scoped makes all of this only apply to the HTML within this component. That's it. Very powerful, and make sure that you're not making any mistakes. You're not accidentally writing CSS that later on you're like, wait, why is this styling being applied here? I don't understand what's happening. Where is this coming from? So scoping is always a good idea, and you'll notice that from now on in all my stylings, I will have the little scoped attribute. That's just my convention. That's the way I do things. I always scope everything. I think it's the cleanest way to write CSS with Vue. Now what we're going to do for the first time in this tutorial, we're going to be adding a new library. Actually, we're going to be adding a couple new libraries, a couple new dependencies to our project. So what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your Vue UI, right? And we're going to install it through here. Now you can, if you're a little bit familiar with NPM, you can just install your dependencies with NPM in the command line. To keep this as simple as possible, especially for beginners, we're going to be installing dependencies using the Vue UI. So if you go to the dependencies on the left and click on the top right, install dependencies, you get a list of what are some of the most, these are the most popular libraries for JavaScript. And we're going to be searching for two specific dependencies to install. All right, we need two dependencies to make SCSS work with our application. So the first one that we're going to be installing is called node-sass. All right, all you have to do is install it, let it install, take a little bit of time. Awesome, and once that's done, you should see node-sass in your main dependencies list here. Remember, we need to install another one. So the second thing that we need to install is called Sass Loader. Select that and install that one as well. Cool, and now that that's installed, everything is basically ready for us to just quickly change to SCSS. It's really, really simple when it comes to Vue and single file applications. So again, we're gonna add in scoped, make sure scoped is there, and we're just gonna say lang equals SCSS. That's it, that's all you need to do, and now your CSS in your component after you've installed those two libraries is using SCSS. Now, what does that enable you to do? That doesn't seem like anything's changed. It just enables us to write our CSS in a much more interesting and friendly way. So for instance, as I mentioned before, user panel is a child of the user profile, right? Same with admin badge. That's a child of the user panel, I believe. User panel badge, yep. So now we're nesting all of our CSS properties. For one, you can see that you can start getting an idea of the hierarchy of the different classes a lot easier. H1, the thing that we're trying to change is within user panel. So let's make sure we put this not inside badge, but make sure it's inside panel. The twoots wrapper and the create twoot, I think create twoot is, that is sitting inside the user panel as well. So let's move this. Is that right? No. Sometimes you need to make sure that all the nesting is working as intended. Make sure you try and make it as clean as possible, because one of the main reasons I like nesting things is, yeah, I can see, okay, the user profile is the parent with a panel inside of it, with a badge inside of that, and it makes things a lot clearer for me. And I think the twoots wrapper is just chilling by itself. Technically, it is inside the parent user panel class, so we will put it all the way down here. And there you go. So all of our stylings are exactly the same. Nothing's changed. But now if I inspect this and we take a closer look, you're going to notice a couple things. So if we look on the side here, the class names have stayed the same. Nothing's changed there. But now you can see that it's way more specific. For one, you've got .user profile, user panel. So it's now including the parent classes in the actual style declaration, which makes it way more specific for us. You might not notice that much of an impact, but it will make things harder to break in the future. You're not going to run into many, if any issues. You can also notice we've got this little data thing here, and this is what scoped is doing. So scoped is saying pretty much only affect, see how these all have the same data sort of attribute here. This is the component. Everything within the component has now been given this little data tag, and that tag is being referenced in all of the CSS declarations. So that's how scoped is working as well. So now your CSS is pretty much foolproof. There is no way for you to accidentally reference the wrong class. Everything is going to be super tight and pretty much cause you no issues from now on. While we're here, we may as well also refactor the twoot item as well. So what have we done here? Twoot item user. Yes, so that should be nested in here. And this is also really important. We've got to make sure you got to set every component to the SCSS language. This is also really awesome. You can do something cool with things like hover. So we can just do this. So what this does with SCSS, obviously this is not an SCSS tutorial, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but it allows us to just write and hover, right? And this is just going to give us a class that attaches this on top of this. So we're not saying it's a child component or a child class. It is literally add this to this. And it makes it, in my mind, it makes things a lot clearer, but maybe that's because I'm a lot more used to it. It's up to you guys whether you use this SCSS. I just thought I would include it in this tutorial because it's how I'm going to be writing my CSS in throughout the rest of the tutorial. And I didn't want you guys to be confused. Oh, what is he doing there? All right, the next thing with CSS is we're going to be talking about dynamic styles. Now, this is pretty important to Vue and stuff that we're going to be doing within web applications. You want to be able to add styles to different parts, different components based off of whether the data is different or not, right? So to do this and to represent this, we're going to be doing something really fun, I think is fun, which is to add a word count to the new tweet field that we just created in the previous chapter, a word count to this. And so if it goes over 180 characters, we're going to say, hey, it's going to be a character count, right? We're going to say, hey, you've exceeded it, and we want this to just go red. We want it to go red and say, hey, you've entered too many characters. This is supposed to be a tweet, supposed to be short, 180 characters max, right? Okay, so to get started with this word count, the way we're going to implement it is we're going to create a computed property. This computed property will dynamically update when the character count of that field has changed. And this is really, really simple. So we'll create a new computer property called new tweet character count. And all we're going to do is just return this dot new tweet content dot length. Dot length will just give us, okay, when you're saying dot length for a string, it'll say how many characters are in that string. When you say dot length for a list, it gives you how many objects or how many things are in that list. So when we're referencing a string, it's just going to give us the amount of characters, and that's it. That computed property will now always reactively change to how many characters are in this string. So we're going to put this on the template. We're going to say, hey, next to the new tweet label, let's add the new tweet character count, and we're just going to say out of 180 to make it clear to our future users that we're counting the characters and you should keep it under 180. So now when we start typing, blah, 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 it goes all the way up. Now what we want to do is you can just go over 180. There's no problem there, right? It's not doing anything. And what we want it to do is to say, hey, you've gone way over the character limit. We want it to shout at you and say, this is not okay. We want to do this with styles. We don't want to actually have text on the screen. We just want to say, hey, make everything go red. You can't have this over 180. So the way that we're going to do this is add a class called exceeded that makes everything go red. And we need to dynamically only have that class implemented when the character count is over 180. So we're going to apply this on the form here. And we're going to say class. Now remember I mentioned this earlier, the colon here makes this attribute sort of dynamic. It makes it more programmatic. It's not just we're not just entering a string in here like over on this class. We're saying, hey, this is going to be a little bit, this is more JavaScript code and not just a class name. So what we're going to do is say class. We're going to say, first of all, what do we want the class to be, right? And I'm going to say dash dash exceeded. That's just sort of convention for me. You can name it anything. You could just have it normal exceeded. It doesn't really matter. This is the class name. It could be anything that you want. And now we say, what is the condition for this class to actually be applied? And so we say new tweet character count is more than 180, right? That's it. We're now applying this class when this condition has been met. And you can change this to whatever you want. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add some stylings for that class, right? Because right now, even if it adds the class, it doesn't actually do anything. The class needs some styling. On the form, what was the form name again? Create tweet. So down here, remember now that we have SCSS, we can do something cool and say that. So just when this class is alongside this class, so and is like attached to, right? We're going to say make the color red, make the border color red, I don't know, whatever. And see, now you can see the color of things has started to go red. We can even say button. Yeah, we can go button background color red. That makes this red. It's really standing out now. Now I want to change the border to none and the color to white. I was thinking, you can't tweet this. It's too long. So yeah, that is dynamic styling. It's really, really simple. You just give it a condition and a class that you want it to have under that condition, and then just give that class some styles and watch it happen. So if we remove all of this, now that it's under 180, right, it doesn't meet this condition anymore. That styling is gone. And if we just give it a bunch more, make it right on the edge, I'm going to open this up just so you can see the class being added, what's happening there. So we have this form, right? I'm going to add a little bit too much, 186, and it's added this exceeded class to the form. And that's giving it dynamic styling. We remove some characters and exceeded disappears. So we're adding and removing classes based off of a condition. There's a lot you can do with that. And that's super awesome. The last thing we're going to discuss with styling is going to be global stylings. Now, this is probably something at some point everyone will come across and be like, how do I apply some styles to everything? Because you don't want to just add a bunch of styles into your root app, right? At the end of the day, sometimes you want to have a lot of global stylings, right? You want to change a lot of different things. You want to have a default class for buttons and all of this sort of stuff. So how do we add some global stylings that we can reference throughout our application? So first of all, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that your the language of your app is SCSS. That's quite important. If this doesn't get applied, then your application won't start up with SCSS in mind, and it won't actually load our global SCSS stylings. So make sure that your application at a root level has set the language to SCSS. That's pretty important. And it's something that like I've missed multiple times when I've set up multiple projects. It's something I always forget. Next, we want to create a folder that we're going to keep all our stylings in. So we're just going to call it styles. And we're going to add a new file called base.scss. And ideally what you want to do is just import this base CSS into your program, into your project. And within the base CSS, you can then import a bunch of other CSS files that you put into this folder. And we'll do that. Actually, I don't think we do that in this tutorial, but it's pretty straightforward. And it's really not super related to Vue. This is more getting more into SCSS stuff. So I would recommend looking that up in the future. But we want to add a really basic global styling, which is just and this is actually another reason why global styling is important. This application or this app styling, this is sitting inside the body, and we need to change the body styling because for some reason it automatically starts off with a margin. If we see here, it automatically gets a margin of 8 pixels, which is just annoying. Why do I want that margin on my application? So what we're going to say is margin 0 on this global styling. Now the last thing that we need to do is import this style before or while the application is starting up. And the way that we do that is we make a new file that becomes a configuration file for Vue. So this is quite important. We're getting into some more like Webpack stuff, like we're injecting things before the application has actually been served. So you want to create a file. It's very important that you get the name of this right, vue.config.js. So Vue, when served, will look for this file on startup. And it has to exist in your root folder. So not in your source folder. Make sure it's not in your source. It's in your root folder right at the top, vue.config.js. Vue needs to be able to find this file when it starts up. Cool, so then we're going to do module.exports. You don't need to really understand what we're doing too much here, all right? All of this is sort of, it starts to get into more Webpack stuff and we're injecting things. You don't need to understand it at all until we get to a certain point. So we're saying module.exports, right? We're creating an object there. Inside that, we're creating a key called CSS. Inside that, we're going to say loader options. Inside that, we nest this a little bit. We say Sass. And then inside that, we're in the last one, we say additional data. and then we put a string here, right? At import, and then the name of the file, right? So we're saying the root, the source folder, /styles/base.scss. And then you have to put a colon there as well. Make sure all of that is there. So this is just going to be sort of chucked at the start of our Webpack loader for SCSS, and it's going to import this file. And that's how we start applying global stylings. Now it's important, you can see here, this is still, it's still not applied, even though I created that file. It's important that you stop the server. So normally, as you can see here, when we serve it, it hot reloads for development. But what we've just done is add something that in the process of starting up our application is so early on that it doesn't hot reload. The Vue config is not something that is hot reloaded. It's something that is loaded once the second we start our server, and then that's it. So we need to stop it and then start it again for it to be looked at. Now, I often run into issues where I've somehow set something tiny wrong and this doesn't work, but we'll see how we go. So I'm gonna hard refresh. Yes, okay, for the first time ever, this has worked perfectly from the get-go. So you can see now this body has this margin styling that we've applied in our global CSS. And I think we can change this to say like margin 100 or 1,000, and it will, oh no, it's saying it does automatically. So now this styling will automatically change. And you can see we've added a crazy margin on everything. So once you've imported that file, now it will hot reload, but you need to make sure that you close it and stop the server and start it for this Vue config to be read in the first place. And that's it. That is global stylings. You can now add whatever you want to this file, and it will be applied to your entire application. You can also import other SCSS files that you put in your styles folder. You can sort of separate everything out. I like to create a variables.scss file and put a bunch of like color variables so I can reference it really easy in my application, common colors that I use, animations. There's a lot that you can sort of get into when it comes to this global stylings folder. So it's always been very useful for me to have it. Hopefully it's useful for you, but you don't need it as well. You can also just put all your stylings within the components and never really reference global stuff. Except I feel like this body one is pretty important because that margin seems really unnecessary. But yeah, now between this chapter and the next chapter, I'm going to be doing some refactoring. This one's going to go a little bit more in depth because this is now the end of sort of the beginner section of this tutorial. The next section goes a little bit deeper. We're going to start going into the composition API, into Vuex and state and stores. We're going to get into the Vue router. Getting into these little bit more juicier ideas and concepts. So I'm going to do a little bit of refactoring off camera just to make the application look nicer and set us up for the next chunk of chapters that we have ahead of us. So thank you guys for watching up to this point, and let's move on to chapter 6.5, I'm going to call it, because I'm going to quickly go over the refactoring before we go over to chapter 7. Alrighty guys, chapter 6.5. Now this, the reason I've got a 6.5 chapter is before we go on to what is kind of the second half of this tutorial series, which is more advanced stuff. We're getting into the composition API, the Vuex store and Vue router. I did want to do a little bit of refactoring. As you can see here, it looks a little bit different. I wanted to add a little bit more styling to set up for some future stuff, change the code, clean up the code a tiny amount. I've obviously not made it super good. I tried not to waste too much time just because this is a tutorial. And I've added one extra little file that we're going to be using later on. So I just wanted to go over the changes in this 6.5 chapter. It's going to be a very, very quick chapter just to go over the changes before we move on to some new stuff. If you don't really care what we've changed and you want to just get into learning some new features, just skip ahead to chapter 7, the Vue 3 composition API. So as you can see, I've added some styling here. I've just moved some stuff around. I've made it a little bit cleaner. When we add like new tweets still work, we can tweet some stuff. I've cleaned up some of the stuff we built before. I've sort of removed any unnecessary features. So favoriting tweets I've removed for now because all I was doing was printing to the console, which isn't really necessary for future stuff we're doing. And the other thing I've done is I've created this users.json file in our assets folder, because we're going to pretend that this is our API so we can start referencing a few more users. So I've just grabbed some other people I follow on actual Twitter, J. Cole, Curtis Connor, and Bo Burnham. So this will give us the ability to list some users for something we're going to be doing in the router chapter. Other than that, you guys can take a look really quickly at some of the CSS changes I've made, so you can just see some stuff in here. Nothing too fancy. I've just tidied it up a little bit while I took a little bit of a break between chapters. This is what this looks like. This is mostly the same, the user profile stuff. I don't think anything's too crazy there. The app, I've just added a navigation bar, as you can see. So we've got Twitter, as in like that's the logo. And Mitchell Romney, this is supposed to be like your user. And so we're going to be utilizing that a little bit more when we get to the Vuex store. On that chapter, I think it's chapter 8 or maybe chapter 9. Chapter 9, yes. We're going to be getting to utilizing it. So I'm just setting some stuff up for the next few chapters. And that's pretty much it. Nothing too crazy going on, but yeah, just wanted to cover that we've done some refactorings, and I wanted to address that before we get started on chapter 7, because I assume there are going to be people jumping into this video and skipping straight to chapter 7 because it's the Vue 3 composition API, and it's quite a new and big topic for beginner and experienced Vue developers alike. So yeah, that's pretty much where the code currently stands. And I think we're ready to move on to chapter 7, the Vue 3 composition API. Alrighty, it's now time for chapter 7, the Vue 3 composition API. This is where we get to do some really juicy, very new to Vue 3, and it's going to be a fundamental and core way that your thinking about Vue changes a bit from Vue 2 to Vue 3. A lot of what I've taught up until this point has been, this is pretty much how Vue works up until Vue 3. And this is the first real change we're making with Vue 3, which is the composition API. Now I've got another tab here it's basically documentation for the composition API and why it's there and what it changes. So you can see here, this is what the composition API looks like, at least in the documentation. Instead of having our data function that returns our data and methods key that returns all these methods, we now have this one setup sort of entire, well, it looks like a function, setup function that sort of figures out everything and then returns what we want to be able to be referencing in our template. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to convert our create tweet panel into this new composition API sort of format, because it has data, it has a computed property, it has some methods. It's a very useful use case. It even has an emit, which will change as well. Very useful use case to show how we adapt everything to the new composition API. If you want to look into why they made the composition API and why you might want to use it, they have a lot more information here. I'm not going to go too in depth on it, but basically it changes the way that you lay out the structure of your code, and it allows you to better organize, as you can see here, logic reuse and code organization. It allows you to better organize your code and be a lot more purposeful with how you want things to be laid out and organize your whole code base. So I definitely recommend going through. I mean, they've really detailed why they've added this. And right before we get into changing the actual code, I do want to quickly mention that you don't have to use the composition API at all. It doesn't necessarily enable more Vue features. You're not going to miss out on anything if you don't use the composition API. The composition API has been built with the intention that it is going to enable cleaner code, especially in very large code bases or for teams of people working in a very large front end. But especially if you're new, you're working on a small project by yourself, you're not going to really notice that many big differences or benefits from it. It's built with the intention of being incrementally adoptable. So what that means is you can use it on some components and not others. You can start using it on every component you build from now on, but you don't have to change your previous ones. You don't have to refactor old stuff if you don't want to. You can just use it when you want to use it. As a different way of representing basically the same data. So it's up to you if you want to use it. I'd say if you're a beginner, don't stress too much about it. If you want to become a Vue developer and you feel quite confident in your Vue skills, I think it's definitely something to learn going into the full release of Vue 3, and when companies start to fully adopt Vue 3 as their sort of main version. I think it's going to be useful to know how it works. But yeah, it depends on your skill level and what you're interested in doing with Vue. So just keep that one in mind. You're not forced to use the composition API, and you can pick and choose when and where you want to use it. Makes it very, very flexible to sort of learn and adapt into your projects. Cool, so let's get started with refactoring this create tweet panel and changing pretty much all of this into being represented in a much different way. So we're going to start by everything new about the composition API starts with this setup function. Similar to how we have this data function, we've got a setup function, but everything now will sit within that setup. So the first things first is our data. We have this just state data of the component that we want to now represent in the composition API. So to get started with that, the best way to represent this, there is a couple of ways you can do this, but the best way to do this is the same way that they mention in the documentation, which is to create a state object, right? This state object then becomes reactive, something that we have to purposely implement. So let's first of all import, and we're going to be doing you do more imports with the composition API. You're importing a few more things before we could reference, I don't know, everything sort of worked out of the box. This is sort of, you have to be a little bit more purposeful with how you're writing things. So we're just going to import reactive, right, from Vue, easy as that. And then we're going to create a const called state that is using the reactive import we just imported. And it's going to just be, it's just going to be our data. We can copy and paste our data here into there, and that's it. That's it. We can just delete this data thing. And the only thing left for us to do here is to go, hey, we need to return, when using the composition API, we need to return everything that we want to be rendered in or everything that we want to be able to reference sort of within the template. So we're returning the state. Now, if you're thinking about things and how things are currently working, you're going to realize, hey, all of this doesn't work anymore because we now need to reference them as state dot the value that we had before. Now that will work. Now that we've added the state and we can reference the state in our template, everything's all fine. We've pretty much refactored from old version to new version with the state. Let's move on to computed. So computed also works quite differently. We need to add a computed import. We need to make sure we import the computed sort of function from Vue. Next, we're going to create a const called new tweet character count. Same name as what we named it in the old version of the Vue sort of interface. Const equals reactive. Computed. And then you're going to kind of, inside the computed, you're basically going to run a mini function in here. It's like a callback. And you're going to return this. Oh, no, not this. Sorry, you're going to return. I'm still getting used to the composition API as well. State.new tweet content.length. So pretty much the same thing that we have in there. So this is wrapping. It's basically the same as this function. This is identical to this. The difference is we're wrapping it in a computed function to make sure that this item is going to be reactive and is going to constantly be updating itself based off of if its dependencies, if the things inside of it are changing. The next thing we need to do, you need to remember with the composition API to always be returning the new properties that you're adding. You need to make sure you're sending them to the template. And then that's sending it up there, and everything should be working there. The next and the last thing for us to do is to add this method. And this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to just create like a normal JavaScript function. And then we can return create new tweet there. So functions tend to be the easiest one, right? With computed, we have to wrap it. With the state, we have to wrap it in a reactive thing. But functions, we can just say, hey, this is a normal function. Remember, we do have to change this to state. We are changing the state. We're no longer changing this object. We're changing the state. And I'm going to remove this little methods key here. Now you can see I've kind of left out this emit because this changes a little bit. We have to do something a little bit different when it comes to emit now. So we have to use the context of the component. And to get to the context, it's actually the second option. And so setup actually returns options. The first one is your props. So if you have props defined here, like you did before, that would be returned in here, and that's how you would use it throughout your setup. And then you have this CTX, which stands for context. So you would then use CTX. Now you can obviously name these blah blah blah, whatever you want, and reference them however you want. You could also just call this the full word context if you wanted and use that. Typically, developers tend to just use CTX as an easy way to do it. Remove the $sign, and that's it. Now you have your emit working again. Just make sure to use this, the context, which is the second value returned from your setup, and .emit. And there you go. We'll add a little semicolon there. And then the last thing we need to do, because I've forgotten, is this obviously needs to change to state.new tweet content. It's going to be pretty easy to miss these certain things, and you're going to have to do a little bit of debugging while you're refactoring. But as you can tell, it's very simple to just move things over to the new version. It may, as a beginner especially, I can see how it may seem more complicated than the original version. So again, you don't have to feel intimidated to use this, the composition API. This is personal preference. And is something to learn once you feel a lot more comfortable with Vue. So if we go in here and we say hello and we tweet it, we say hello, actually let's refresh, do it again, everything's working as intended, we can sort of tweet whatever we want, and everything is working as it was working before. That is awesome. Now I'm going to go through and just refactor the rest of the application. I'm not going to step-by-step walk through it like we did with this one, because you guys can already get an idea of how everything works. So I'm just going to speed through it and see you guys once I'm done. Okay, cool. So everything has been refactored. You can see here that this is the one that we worked on together. This is our user profile. So just changing everything up here and adding the setup and then changing the state. So state.user.username, stuff like that. Luckily the tweet item didn't really need anything refactored, so that makes it really easy for us. Props pretty much work exactly the same, which is really nice. So yeah, that is the end of the chapter on the composition API. It's really easy to refactor what you did before to what you've done now. If you're trying to just jump straight into the composition API, again, you can just follow this sort of setup. I assume that you're pretty comfortable if you're jumping straight into the composition API, you're comfortable with Vue as it is. So it's just about learning to set up for something like the state, which is pretty similar to your data function from before. Computed properties, again, it's just about really, the composition API just ends up wrapping things in certain Vue specific functions. So a computed, wrap your thing in a computed sort of function, wrap this in a reactive function. Functions themselves work normal, so that's actually great. It actually seems easier, like seems more JavaScripty, seems more normal. Remember that props and context are coming through in the setups. That's how you reference things like emit, and then you have to return it all to the render, so then you can use it throughout your template. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Hopefully that's not too crazy. If you have any questions about the composition API specifically, let me know in the comments below. I'll try and get around to addressing it. But you know, once you've gotten this level of composition API ready, anything else you can just quickly Google for, you know, the documentation, and you can do some more advanced features from there if there's anything you need that wasn't covered in this. So now we're going to move on to chapter 8, which is routing with the Vue router. We get to do some much cooler technical stuff now. Welcome guys to chapter 8, which is routing with the Vue router. We get to do a bunch of cool stuff with routing, and before we get into actually building our router, let's explain really briefly what even is a router or Vue router. So within the context of a single page application, which is what we're building now, if you're not even aware of what a single page application necessarily is, it's basically just, it says it in the name, it's a single page application. So you're not refreshing the page, you're not loading a new page. Everything is technically the exact same page as far as the browser is concerned. And we sort of fake different pages within using JavaScript and changing the entire, you know, all the DOM elements on the page. We pretend that pages are changing, but actually, as far as the browser is concerned, it is one page. It's one page that's just dynamically changing all the time with fake links and all of these different things happening in the background. So it's really, really cool, and something that wasn't really around that much a decade or two ago, and now we can do these really complicated stuff. And that's the sort of stuff that Vue and React and Angular and Svelte, that's what they all enable you to do, is build something like a single page application, something that is just not feasible to do by yourself with normal JavaScript. So that's a router. In that context then is basically the library or the tool that we use to pretend to go to different pages. Now you could say something like Twitter. Twitter is basically, it's a single page application. There's plenty of web apps that a single page application, yet you can go to different pages. You can click on a user profile and go to a user profile page, but the browser itself is not refreshing a page. It's just changing the content that you're seeing in a way that makes it feel like it's a new page. And the way we do that is within the context of Vue. It is basically going to a new page. We're rendering a new template. The URL will change, but the browser itself doesn't feel like anything's changed. And so a router enables us to do that in a really simple way. So the way that we're going to get started is going back to our Vue CLI that we have set up here, and we're going to add Vue router. Just click that, continue, and that's it. It'll install it for you. Now, the reason we do it this way is because, especially in the current context of me using Vue 3 right before it's being released, installing Vue router through the Vue CLI, make sure that I'm installing the right Vue router for Vue 3, and telling you guys to do it this way also means that like Vue CLI will automatically give you the right versions of Vue router. So that, you know, you're not running into any issues. It will just work. The Vue CLI installs things in a way that's just magic, and it's great. So if we head over to our application now, into our code, you're going to see it's actually just added some files. Not only has it's not just installed a library, it's a plugin. It's installed a plugin basically, which what that does is it will refactor code, it will add new code, and it will change some things. And so we have to adapt to those changes. The first things first is if we go to our app now, it's changed. It's added some stuff that we might not necessarily want. So it's actually removed my navigation. And if I Control Z, I might be able to take it back. There we go. So I've run it back. Just keep in mind, it will remove, or it will sort of reset your app. And then you can, depending on your ID, most of the time you can just Control Z and remove it back. So we'll keep that there. It's also added a views folder, which we're going to start using now. Up until now, we've been using our components folder to do everything, create every single file component. Now we're going to be using this views folder. So the way that this works is the views folder is pretty much your pages. These are your high-level parent pages, home, about. You can have like user profile is going to be something that we build, stuff like that. And then components become these smaller parts that go into each view, that go into each page. So first things first is I'm going to delete the about page. We don't want it. We don't need it. It's not going to be part of this tutorial. It's irrelevant. We have this home page that they've built. We're also just going to clear that one out because this pretty much looks exactly like what happened when, what the app looked like when we started this whole tutorial. Clean it out, make it super good, and then the next thing we're going to do is go to this new router. So this is what we've added. This is the bread and butter of the Vue router, is this one file. And we're going to quickly run through what's happening here before we start changing it. So we have a constant. We've just got a variable here that is a list, right? It's an array of different objects, and these objects are routing objects. So they contain three things. You can actually add a few more keys to these objects, but these are the main ones that you're going to need. The path, so you know, just a naked URL basically represents the home page. The name of the page, which will become important later on, and the component that the page should render, which is pointing to this home view. I've also got the same thing with about here. Now you can see it's doing something called lazy loading, which is something that, especially when you start building bigger applications, you're going to want to look into. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to skip it. But just know lazy loading is something that you can do here in the router, and it's really quite straightforward. You can see that it's nearly the same thing. We're just basically running a callback to import the file instead of referencing it directly. So as we deleted the about page, we're going to delete the about route. And then you have router, create router. So this is where the route is actually being created. So routes is basically just this variable that's sitting there right now. It doesn't do anything by itself until we create a router. So we've got a function here from Vue router, creates a router. It's got this history object, or this history key, which we're going to ignore for now, and a routes. It does have a routes key, but we're just referencing this routes variable in place of that routes key. So saying routes here is the same as saying routes is this variable. And that's it. We're defining the routes of this router and then exporting it. And then what the plugin that we installed for Vue router has actually done is this main file. It's just saying, hey, this app, our app, use the router. It's just added this one little thing. It's importing the router, and that's it. The router just works out of the box like that. We are going to be making one change though, and I'm going to show you why. So going back to our application, if I refresh now, if you guys look at the top at the URL, we now have this hashtag. And this is basically the default way for the router to work is to be working with the history of pages and routing different pages using this hashtag in the URL, which is pretty annoying. You never see any other website really use this, and you don't want it there. And so we're going to be changing our history mode to remove it. Everything will work exactly the same, it just won't have that hash there anymore. So instead of create web hash history, we're just going to say create, I think it's web history. So it's just without the hash in the name of it. We're going to delete that import, and that's pretty much it, right? Now we can go to the default one, and it's not going to add that hash. We don't have to worry about the hash ever showing up ever again. That's about it. There is one more thing to do with that, the history version and the routing and the hash and everything like that we have to address in the final chapter, which is deploying to production, but it's very, very easy to manage. And I'm going to show you guys, I'm going to hold your hand through making sure everything works. So to show you all the features of the router and how to use it and implement it within your application, what we're going to do to start off with is to move our user profile from components to the views, because the user profile is a page. It's not just a part of a page, it is an entire page. And we should be treating it as such. Now you are going to have to fix some imports as well. So we're just going to fix these. Normally you can do something like at components and at refers to your source folder. This was working in my before test, but right now it's just not having it, and I have no idea why. So we're just going to do some relative imports here. And you can try both and see what works in your application. So now that we have this user profile view, we want to add it as its own page to the router. So this is where we're adding our first new route. So we're going to say the path is, now this is where we're going to get into some tricky stuff, but it's going to be user, right, slash, and we want this to represent the ID. We want the URL to be dynamic. So depending on what user profile you go to is going to depend on sort of the URL and what user ID you've got in there. So we're going to say user ID like that, putting that colon there, and then user ID is basically calling this a variable. So when we go to a URL that is user slash something, it's going to match this path. And that something is going to be sort of interpolated as a user ID variable that we can start pulling and referencing later on. So I'm sorry if that sounds complicated, and it's going to become much clearer as we move forward. Trust me. So we're going to give it a name as well, like we have with the home page, user profile. And we're going to reference a component. We're just going to say user profile. That'll autofill thanks to my IDE. Awesome. And we have that there now. Okay, cool. Now that we've added this route, we have to do one more thing. If we go back to our app, you can see that we're trying to reference our user profile as a component like before, but things have changed, right? This user profile is no longer a component, it's a page. And how do we start referencing our pages? How do we get our page to render on the screen depending on what URL we're on and everything like that? So what we're going to do first of all is remove the user component from the app. It's no longer a component and it's not going to be rendered this way. Next, we're going to change this. Wherever we were rendering the user profile before, we're going to change this to router view. And this one tag here is going to be injected with whatever page we're on. Whatever page we're on, according to the router, this component here is going to be injected basically into this router dash view. One last thing we're going to do, just to make it a little bit clearer to us when we're on what page, is I'm going to add a H1 here that just says home. And sorry, one last thing that I did forget to mention is with our path, this actually has to start with a backslash, which sometimes I forget to add. So if we go back to our page now, you can see we are on the home page. We have this navbar always. This navbar is always going to be there because we've added it to our application. And then whatever page we're on is going to be rendered under the navbar. So now we can go to /user/1, and that will take us to the user profile of 1. Now, right now we've built user profile to pretty much always render the exact same thing. I could say user profile 13 and it's going to render the exact same thing because we haven't made it dynamic yet. But you can see how user/a user ID always matches that route and takes us to the user profile. So to get started with trying to make this user profile a bit more dynamic and change depending on what URL we're on, we've got to get that user ID. Once we get this user ID, we can do anything we want, right? We can query an API and say, give me user 13 and render the page with that data. So we're going to go to the user profile here. We've got our composition API all set up, and we're going to start importing some stuff here. So import, the first import we're going to be doing is something called use route, right? From Vue router. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us basically a route object that we can reference. We can say, hey, we can query that object and be like, hey, what route are we on? And give me some more information about it. We're also going to import a computed property from Vue if we haven't already done that in our component. And then we start doing some cool stuff. So I'm going to do it at the top of this setup here. And the first thing we're going to do is const route equals use route. That's it. So now we have a route object that we can reference, or a route variable. The next thing is we want to get our user ID. And so to do that, we're going to make user ID a computed property. So it's always going to be adapting and changing depending on what URL we're on. And we're going to get that user ID by using the route object that we just created. I'm going to say the parameters of that route, get the user ID. So the way this works is in this path where we've set this user ID sort of variable here, when we match this path in our URL, user/something, whatever that something is has now been put into the router saying, hey, the parameter of this current route, the user ID parameter is filled in with whatever's in the URL. So hopefully it's not too confusing. It is sort of difficult for me to put into perfect words, but the user ID, that we can get it from the URL from this. And then we can basically just say, we can return the user ID here, and then reference it on the page somewhere. So we'll say, let's make a little H2 here. That is just user ID. And then that's there. So that's 13. And if I change to blah, 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 the user ID becomes this. So now we're pulling it from the URL and we can reference it on the page. So now we can reference this user ID wherever we want. And in a real world application, you would say, okay, if user ID exists, so you want to double check that there is a user ID, otherwise you might have issues. If user ID, then, fetch user from API with the user ID. And that will run, another function you've defined somewhere else to fetch from your API and get that user information. And then you can sort of return the user to the state and all of this cool stuff. Today, we're not really going to be going that in depth. We don't have a backend API to utilize. But what we do have is, if you guys remember, in chapter 6.5, I did a little bit of refactoring and I created this users JSON. And we're basically going to use this as a pretend user backend API. So we have this users.json, and to be able to reference this in the best way possible, I'm going to change this. I'm going to rename this to users.js, and then we're just going to export it. Const export users equals blah. Oh, I've done that wrong. Export const. I am a professional web developer. Don't worry about it. Cool. So now we can reference that, and we can say import users. I want my IDE to auto do it. Users. There we go. And we can reference that. So now we have user here. So I'm going to delete this, and we're going to say user is users with it's basically the key of the user ID, or null. And if it's null, we have some other issues going on. Actually, instead of that, because that's just going to be confusing for us, we're going to just say users1. So it's always going to get me. It's going to get, well, the first user in that list, if we can't match anything. If we're saying user 5 and there's only 4 users. Now that I'm realizing also, we actually need to do one more thing here. This isn't going to work as we intended. That'll work fine. We're just going to say user ID, -1, sorry. -1, and this should be 0, just because array start at 0, and our user ID technically starts at 1. But yes, so this will pull the user ID and try and find the user in our users array and fill that in. And so that's basically us mocking in a really simple way, us pulling a user from a database. So, must use value. Yes, this is another part of the composition API. You can't just reference computed properties in the setup as they are. We actually have to use .value. Now it's fine to return the user ID to the state. The state will use the value as intended, but within the setup, we have to make sure that we get any computed state, we have to use .value. But luckily, Vue will tell you, hey, use the right thing. Now, I've also made one more mistake, and I'm gonna leave this one in the video just so you guys can see, hey, mistakes happen often. And this object was not sort of laid out as I intended. So users should be an array. That's pretty much it. That should be good. If we refresh now, it works. So it's automatically pulling Mitchell Romney. And if we go to user 1, it's gonna pull the exact same thing. You can see the ID here. We're actually gonna remove the ID from the template because you guys have already seen that point. And what we're gonna be doing now is if we go to user 2, we should actually see something different. We see J. Cole, and see this is J. Cole, the musician, the amazing artist. I've just made a fake user for him in our user list here. He doesn't have any tweets yet. He's not an admin, and I haven't even said his email because obviously I don't know J. Cole's email, or else I'd probably be doing bigger and better things than this video. But if we go to user 3 and user 4, you can see how going to different URLs now is giving us different users and how we can use the same. This is all rendering the exact same file, right? This is all rendering the user profile file, but now things are becoming dynamic. They're changing based off of the data that we're putting in, which is really awesome. What we can also do here is probably add a tweet. I don't know, this might work. No, it doesn't work. I think the way that we make this work is tweets should not be null. Tweets should be an empty array, and that's another mistake on my part. So let's refresh, and if we just say hello, tweet it, bam, we can now add tweets to all of these new people. So that's how to get a dynamic route working with user IDs and going to different user pages. Now the next thing we got to do is linking. How do we add links to our page? We don't want to actually add a normal HTML link because that will refresh the page. That'll go against the entire point of a single page application. So we've got to do it in a very Vue specific way, which is quite awesome. So the link I want to add is I want to make this Twitter logo basically clickable to go to our homepage. And it's super, super easy, and you guys are just going to love how easy this is. We have our navigation. I've called it navigation logo, right? We've got this little thing here that holds our logo. From this instance, it's just the text Twitter. All we got to do is wrap it in a router.link that says to, and then root URL. That's it. We move our Twitter thing in there, and that's it. Now that makes it look all ugly. We can change that with some CSS stylings. I can go into our global CSS that we set up and just say, hey, text style, I'm trying to remember what it is, decoration style none, or text, let's say color inherit maybe, to get rid of the purple, awesome. And then the underline is like text, sometimes even though you do full-time front-end work for ages, little CSS stuff just avoids you. Font, no, style, none. No, that's not it. Normal. No, that's also not it. Text decoration, none. There we go, text decoration. That was what I was looking for. Cool. So now it looks normal. We're not changing anything. But now you can see as we hover over it, our mouse changes like a link. And if you look in the bottom left, it says localhost 8081, which is basically the root URL. So it's taking us to the right URL. It says the right link. And if we click it though, it doesn't refresh our page. It doesn't take us to a new page. It feels like it does, but the page itself is actually, as far as the browser is concerned, stays the same, but we move to a new place. So now that we're on our homepage, how do we get back to our different users that we have? Because I don't want to have to type in the URL all the time. That seems silly. So what we're going to do in our homepage is, first of all, let's add a style tag. I don't know why that wasn't there to begin with. We're going to make sure we set the language to SCSS like we've learned and scope it. We also just want to say, I just want to give it some proper padding, right? 50 pixels and 5% or something. Whatever we're using on our user profile 50 pixels, 5%. So it's the same sort of padding. That just sort of gives it a little bit of a margin on the sides. Now what we want to do is we want to list all of our users. So now we're starting to utilize everything that we've learned in the past. So I'm going to make a div here and say, I don't know, users list actually. And then what we want to do is we want to create a router link. We're going to say v4 user in users. We will define that later on. We will define users in a second. But then we're going to say to, using our colon to reference something a little bit more programmatic, we're going to say to the name of the route that we want to go to, which is user profile. And that's the name that's been defined here. So this is where the name comes into play. Pushing or creating links based off of named routes is much more reliable, because if we changed this to say profile, all links will still work the same. We don't have to change anything because we're still referencing the same name of the route. So we can change the actual URL without it breaking the entire page. And we'll show that in a second. So user profile, but we need to add params as well with the user ID. So if we say user.user ID, so that will render this page, go to this route and put the, actually with parameters, sorry, we need to say user ID. For the user ID, put this value in. And then for here, we will just say the user.username will just be the thing that is the link that we're clicking on. Now we need to reference users. We're going to implement the composition API that we've been learning. We're just going to return users. We're just going to make sure to import users. And that's pretty much it. So hopefully this works. As always, I forget to add the key. You always need to add the key. And luckily users have an ID. So we're just going to say, this should be ID, not user ID. There we go. Users list, let's give it a bit of styling. Just so they're on top of each other and not right next to each other and unreadable. Awesome. So now we have all of our different users and they're all linkable, right? If you look in the bottom left, we have links to all of them. So I can click on, let's say, Curtis Connor, takes me straight to his page. Click on Twitter, takes me back home. And so you have a page now that you can link around and move around, but it's still one page. As I've said, this is the whole point of a single page application. You don't actually have to load new pages. A lot of the page content is the same. That's why everything is just instant. You're instantly going to a new page. And so yes, that does change when you start trying to make calls to the API to pull that dynamic user data. Yeah, this is super powerful stuff. And if you can get to this point, you can do a lot. We're nearly done with routing. Obviously, routing and the next chapter, Vuex, are actually really large chapters that have to work with a lot because they are very integral to Vue. And there's a lot that you can do with it that are very important. If I didn't teach it in this class, I'm sure that a lot of people would be asking, hey, what the hell do you do? So the last thing we're going to be talking about is router guards. And I'm going to try and be quite quick on this one. So basically, router guards are functions that run before or after each routing move that you make. So if I go to a page, it will run. If I redirect to a new page, if I load the page for the first time, these will run first. And these are useful to redirect people going to pages they're not supposed to be going to. These are useful for pushing people to loading pages before we have loaded their user information, a bunch of different stuff. So we're going to create something really simple. So to start off, you have to reference the router, say before each, that's the router guard. And it comes with, it's async, we're gonna async it up. And it comes with three variables that are passed into it. We have to, from, and next, right? And this is a callback, so we go like this, and it becomes a function, and everything in here will run each time we go to a new route. So what we're gonna do is we're going to create a fake isAdmin flag. Now this would be, you would actually get the user and reference the user, and we're gonna do this a little bit later. Within the Vuex module, within the Vuex chapter, we will be sort of making this a little bit more user reliant, but for now we're faking and we're saying, hey, isAdmin is true. const, we're going to say requires admin is another flag. So does this route require you to be admin? Do you need admin privileges to go to where you're trying to go? So we're going to say equal to.matched. Now, to be honest, I actually don't know why it's sort of presented this way. It's something that I actually copied from the documentation, and that's it. This bit, the meta.requires admin, I understand, but the to matched sum, and then you have to return the record meta. Not too sure. This is just how you represent getting the meta information from a route. And currently we don't have a route with meta information. So let's create one more new route. This one is going to be path admin. Name is going to be admin. And we actually have to create a new admin file. So this is going to be an admin page. We're actually not going to really do anything with it, but it's going to represent a page that normally users should not be able to get to. So we're going to call it admin. I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup here. We're going to add a H1 that says admin. We're going to add our padding. That is 50 pixels and 5%. And that's it. We just have this basic admin page, but we want to make sure normal users cannot get to it. So component is admin. And then we want to add meta and add a flag here. Requires admin is true. So that's what's being checked. This little meta thing, if it exists, these routes don't even have a meta object, let alone a requires admin key to check. So this is a nice way of saying, hey, if it has a meta, if it has meta information, and if it has a required admin key, check if that's true. Otherwise, it's pretty much always going to return requires admin is going to be false. So now we do these our router checks. So we're going to say it's just normal conditions at this point. Requires admin. So does the route need an admin? All right. Do you need to have admin privileges to go to this route? And the route is being referenced here, if you'd missed it, by the to. So to is the place we're trying to go. From is where we came from. And next we'll go into in a second. So does the route require admin? And are we not an admin? Right. So we're saying and not is admin. So if is admin is false, then we want to redirect you. We want to send you away from this page. You should not be able to go where you're trying to go. And all we're going to say, I'm going to do this in a single line condition. Some people don't like single line conditions. I think in this context, it works really well and it's really clean. So we're just going to say name home. So what this is doing is if this condition passes, if you require an admin, but you're not an admin, then we're going to send you home. That's what next does. Next redirects you. Kind of. If you don't put in any parameters here, it'll send you where you're trying to go. If you say next and you put in an actual route name, it will redirect you to that route. So else, if everything is fine, we just say next. And that's it. Hopefully this makes sense here, guys. This is a really simple way to do router guards. I'll show you how it works now. So if we try and go to /admin, it'll take us there because we've said is admin is true. We're pretending that this user has admin privileges. Now, if we say is admin is false, saying that the user doesn't have admin privileges, you can see we've already been redirected. And if we try and go to that admin page, it just won't let us go there. It's blocking us. The second we try and get into the page, it's saying, wait a minute, you're not an admin, and sending us back home. So really powerful stuff. This is how you're going to allow certain pages to only be viewable by certain admins, or you can do a bunch of cool things depending on your project before you actually get the user to the page that they're trying to go to. So that's pretty much everything for our routing. We've covered router guards, router links, creating new routes, why we have a router. There's a lot to unpack there. So hopefully you guys have been able to follow along. We do have one last major chapter before we deploy this to production. And the last chapter of this, if you're unaware, is going to be deploying it to production. You are going to be able to send a link to your friends and say, hey, look what I made, which is super awesome. So the next chapter, chapter 9, is state management with Vuex. Very important topic, and I'm excited to jump into it with you guys. We are nearly at the finish line. I really appreciate you guys sticking through this whole video, and I really commend you for sitting down and really trying to learn a new language. It's going to be very useful, and I've had so much fun building applications with Vue. So I'm so excited to help you guys on your journey to becoming Vue developers and building your own projects. Anyway, let's move on to Chapter 9, State Management with Vuex. Alrighty guys, Chapter 9, State Management with Vuex. Now, obviously, we're going to start off this chapter with what the hell is Vuex? Vuex is, if you're familiar at all with React, it is Vue's version of Redux. And both of those are sort of what's called global state management, right? It's a state, it's a sort of global state of your entire application. So if we go, for instance, let's go to create to panel, this component. We have state here. This is like local state. This is the state of the component. This is data that is being held within that component. But there is certain information that we are going to want to hold over the whole application, that we're going to want to reference throughout every part of our application in every component. This is where state management and Vuex comes into play and makes things really easy, especially as your application gets larger and more complicated. So what we're going to do, like we did with Vue Router, we're going to install Vuex through Vue CLI. All you have to do is go to plugins and click add Vuex. For the same reasons as I mentioned in Vue Router, it's going to give you the right version of Vuex for your Vue version. And same for me here, running the beta version of Vue 3. I'm going to get the right Vuex version that's just going to work like magic straight off the bat. Awesome. Once that's done, let's go back to our code and you'll see it's added a new store folder similarly to how it added the router folder. So I'm going to just minimize everything else that we have going on right now. And you see, yeah, so it's just added this store. It looks very empty. It doesn't look like much is going on. And if your IDE is throwing some errors saying that the module is not installed, you can try and run npm install. I'm pretty sure the plugin does install it properly. So it's just my IDE being a little bit difficult, but you can run it just to make sure your IDE is fine and that it gets all the sort of references rebuilt as it needs. But anyway, you should have this store file and it looks pretty darn empty and not like it's doing that much. So this is what it's created, and it's also added the store to your application here on the main.js file, the same way that it's added your router. And you really don't need to touch this file at all, not throughout this tutorial anyway. So I'm going to close all my tabs just because I end up having a lot of tabs open, and we're going to open up the store. Now, the way that the store works, as you can see, it's split into 4 different sections, right? And what people like to do, just to make it look a little bit neater, is to actually separate these guys out. So we're going to cover the state, mutations, and actions. I'm going to ignore modules for now because we are going to get into modules a little bit later on. By the name though, you can probably assume roughly what that's going to sort of entail. So what we're going to do with the store to show you guys how it works is we're going to create a user store or informations to, or the right references and tools to store user data in our store. It's really as simple as this. In our state, we want to add a user object, and we just want to, default value is null. We have no value, we have no user in there when the store is created. That's it. That is how we reference a user, right? That's how we put a user in the state. Next, we have to explain the difference between mutations and actions. Now, as Vuex is sort of coming along, I think it's nearly rumored that like mutations and actions are gonna at some point be merged into the same thing. But for the moment, I'm using a Vuex version that's not the case. And you may find the mutations and actions sort of methodology in other places. This is not just with Vuex. This pops up in a few other places. So the way that this works is mutations. I'm gonna actually make some comments here for you, right? Mutations are functions that affect the state. So the mutations directly change the state. Actions, on the other hand, are functions that you call throughout your application that call mutations. So in your components, you're not going to be calling mutations directly. So for instance, we're going to set up a set user mutation. It's also convention for mutations to be in all caps, right? Just to make it clear this is a mutation. Put a user in there. So actually, wait, first of all, the first value here is actually state and then a value that we pass in. And we say state.user equals user. And so when we run this mutation in an action, we are passing in a user and we're going to set this state object to the user that we're passing in. Pretty straightforward. And our action here, we're going to create a normal function called setUser. The first value is sort of an object of all of these different helpers, and the helper that we want is commit. That's how we reference a mutation. It starts to get a little bit more complicated, but please try and keep up if you can, and ask me any questions in the comments, of course, if you're really struggling. But sometimes it is better to just copy what I'm doing on screen, and then when it works, it helps you figure out what you've actually just done. So if you don't understand beforehand, don't worry, try it, and you'll probably likely understand afterwards. So we've got a set user action here, and we're going to commit, right? We have to name the mutation that we're trying to commit. So set user and the user that we're passing in, or the data that we're passing in. So this is what our store, our Vuex store looks like. Now, it may seem, and I know I felt this way when I was a beginner, it seems counterintuitive to have to pass into this action, to pass into this mutation to change the user. Why can't I just say, call this mutation to begin with? Or why can't I just say, hey, state user equals something? There are honestly a few reasons for this that start to get unnecessarily technical for a beginner tutorial. So I'm going to just say, follow this standard. Your mutations are the only things that affect the state, and your actions are the things that run a bunch of processes, and your actions can really run whatever, but your actions should also be the only things running mutations. And then you run actions from your components and your pages and all of that good stuff. Do it this way, and when you feel more comfortable with Vue, you can start exploring why they are this way and going against the grain and doing things your own way if you so choose. Now what we can do is we're going to go to our router that we set up in the previous chapter, go to our router guard, and we're going to make this isAdmin flag a little bit more dynamic and actually make it reference a proper user. So what we're going to do to start off here is we're going to try and get the user, right? Const user equals store.state.user. We don't actually know what the store is yet, so we're going to have to import the store. I think it's store from, and we just reference the file directly, right? So store, there we go. So that's trying to get the state, the user from the store state. Now, we know that that's null, right? We know that at least when you load the application to start off with, the default value is null, so there is no user there. So what we want to do is, if there is no user, we want to pretty much add a user. Now, in a real world application, if there's no user, you'd want to get the user here. You'd want to actually fetch it from the API, pull something from local storage, the ID, and fetch the user and do all this sort of stuff. But right now, we're just going to fake it. We're going to mock it for the sake of learning Vuex. So we're going to go await, because technically this is an async call, although I think in this context, it really doesn't matter whether you make it async or not. We're just going to say await store.dispatch. So dispatch is the function you call to run actions. And technically, if you did want to run a mutation in this context, it's store.commit. So similarly, how do we use commit in our action? You just say store.commit to run your mutation. You don't say store.actions dot whatever you called the action. You say store.dispatch. You name the name of the action, which we've called set user, and then you pass it in some data, which is going to be, you know, the user information, and we're going to actually get that specifically from let's pull in our users thing that we created over here. So we're going to pull this in actually to sort of fake getting our user. So import users, there we go, and we're just going to say, hey, set this to users 0. So that's going to fill in the first user of this list, which is me, right? My fake Twitter user, and it's going to put that into the state. So if we refresh here, you can't tell yet, but that's the user that's in the state. The way that we're going to find that out really is if we go to our application, our navigation bar, we have state.user.username here. We're referencing the username in the top right on our nav bar. We want this now to be not just handled in our app. We don't want this saved here. We want this to be pulled from the user in the state. because that is where you're going to be storing the user to be referencing from now on throughout your application. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to say, remove all of this and remove this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say const store equals use store. So this is how we're going to access the store from our components. I'm going to say use store from Vuex. So import and this is very specific to the composition API. If you're not using the composition API, this is going to look differently. And I would recommend Googling this a little bit. But I'm pretty sure it's just referencing the store file like you normally would. So this is a little bit different. You can just import the store and use it like that, I believe. Similarly to how we did it in here. We're actually using two different versions. This is importing the store, and this is a more a composition API approach of just saying, hey, use store function to give me the store. Now we want to just get the user from the store. So const user equals computed, which we need to import. So import computed from Vue. And remember, this is a callback function, so we just need to return store.state.user. And so now we have this user variable that holds our user from the store. And we can just return the user, adjust it up here. And now if we refresh, this user up here is being pulled from the store. It's no longer being hand fed in. This is going through a bunch of different steps, right? The first step is in our router, we're loading the page the first time. We're saying, hey, get the user from the store. Hey, there is no user in the store. All right, cool. Then let's dispatch the action set user and fill it in with the first user in the array of users from this file that we created manually. Then what that's doing, it's running this action. It's saying, hey, commit the set user mutation, which then changes the state, and then your user is set to the user that you put it in. Seems like a lot of steps, but when your application gets bigger and more complicated, this is going to be very, very useful and is going to solve a lot of problems for you. So this is sort of how the Vuex state works. And that's pretty much how you're going to be storing user info. You can store anything you want in the store, depending on your application. The final step that we're going to be doing is addressing that last little guy down here called modules. And we're going to be modularizing our store. So when you get to a more complex application, you don't want 100 different state things here and 100 different mutations and 100 different actions all in the one file. You want to split it up depending on sort of what area of the site you're sort of attacking. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file here called user.js, and this is going to be like a user state module. We're going to go export const user module. The first thing we have to do is say namespace is true. Now that's going to allow us to specifically reference in the instance of like store.state.user, we want to be able to reference the module first. It's going to make our code a little bit cleaner. It's going to be easier to reference things and not get confused. Our user state is going to exist within like a user module. And so we want to be able to reference it this way. So back to our user module. Then we just set the rest up like we normally would. So a normal store. So what I'm going to do there is just copy and paste what we already have. This is our user module store. And then all we do is we just remove everything that we had set up in the first place. We want to keep them there and empty. Just to sort of initialize a blank store, and then we inject a user module here, or all of our modules. So import user module, and then that sits in our module here. And as I said, all you need to change now, because we've turned it into a module and we've namespaced it specifically, we go user.user. We need to specifically, we need to say for this this module is called user. Because technically if you just imported the way I did, it would technically be called user module, and that's a bit too clunky for our use case. So user module, get that file. This is just basically the same thing, except we've defined it as its own module. And you can see here, this works fine. And then the last thing we need to do is just change where we've also referenced it elsewhere. So change the user there. We also, for actions and mutations, we need to now put user before the thing that we're trying to commit. Within the module though, you can keep this as set user. You don't have to put user / before it or anything like that. You can just keep it like that. And so if we refresh the page, everything works and everything's all good. Now, if you notice here, there is a little error, and I just want to mention this. I could cut it from the video, but I think it's worth noting. In this instance, when we're actually starting our application, technically this page loads for a split second. This page, the app tries to load for a split second before we have a user, right? Because we're setting our user sort of after this page has first started to load. And so you get this error, cannot read property username of null. This is happening in the app sort of component, which is referencing the only time we really use, the thing it has to be referencing is this top right thing here. It's trying to load this before user has been set, but we can't really notice because it's being set so fast and fixing itself, but it's still an error nonetheless. So all we're gonna do is we're just gonna say v-if user. That's it. If I refresh, no error. Now you can't notice any difference really, but that's just to say, hey, we're only gonna try and reference user if there is an actual user. And so that's just a good sort of habit to get into, making sure that anytime you reference a value, you know that that value is always there. Even if it should be there, you should always write the code to be prepared to handle it if it's not there. Cool. We've modularized our store now. It's super easy. And that's basically everything you need to know about the Vuex store. You can now just add as many different parts to the state, add some mutations, add some actions, and use the store throughout your application as much as you want. We are finally ready to enter into chapter 10, which is deploying to Heroku. We're going to deploy our application to production. We're going to put it online so you can get a link and give it to your friends and be like, hey, I built this thing. How cool is this? So hopefully you guys are ready to get into the final chapter, chapter 10. Let's go. Okay guys, chapter 10, deploying to Heroku. We are at the final step. We finally get to deploy our application live online using Heroku, which is a great platform to deploy web apps. It's something I personally use to deploy my web apps. You can see here I have a little Django tutorial here that never actually got released, and at this point is outdated. So if I was going to do a Django tutorial, I'd have to completely rewrite it all. You can see all my actual applications here. If I go to the Earth is Square, I've got a bunch more stuff going on here. So what we're going to be doing is, first of all, I want you guys to create a Heroku account. Sounds pretty straightforward. You guys are all very smart people. It's very straightforward to sign up to a Heroku account. Once you've got that signed up, you should get to something pretty similar to what this personal view looks like. And what I want you to do is I'm going to build it under the Earth is Square as a business sort of thing. And we want to create a new app on Heroku. You should get to this page pretty easily. Now we want to just name it whatever you want to name it. I'm going to say Twitter tutorial video. Awesome. App owner should just be your personal sort of account. Choose a region. If you're in Europe, feel free to do Europe. I just do United States because, you know, I assume most people that are maybe going to interact with my application are going to be coming from the United States. But that said, I may be moving to Europe in a few months, so that could potentially change for me, and I'll just change all my regions. Doesn't really affect too much at all. Don't worry about add to pipeline and create your application. Takes 2 seconds. You now have an application on Heroku. Now this costs nothing, by the way. You can deploy your applications for free, but then to make them paid, to make them a little bit more powerful, only costs you $7 a month to make it run 24/7. Otherwise, the free version will make it run for a little bit and then it'll turn itself off when it's not being used. Cool, so now we have this sort of dashboard, application dashboard on Heroku. It looks like a lot, don't worry. We're pretty much gonna be ignoring most of these. But before we can actually deploy our application to Heroku, we're gonna need to make a few more code changes before that can happen. So heading back to our application, we are going to create a new file here in the root of our entire application, so not in the source. We're going to create it in the root, and we're going to call it server.js. Now this is going to run an Express server. We're going to run Express is a library that it's the most popular JavaScript library for running web servers. It's very lightweight, very simple, which is awesome for us. So we're going to create this file. Before we can actually fill it out, we actually need to install some dependencies now. So heading back to our Vue UI, we're going to go to dependencies and we have to install 4 new libraries. 4 new libraries, so make sure you get all of them. Why am I typing libraries? The first one is obvious. The first one is Express. You can see 54.3 million downloads. It's one of the most popular libraries to exist within JavaScript. So that's how you can tell it's going to be pretty darn good and powerful and supported and documented and all of this sort of stuff. You're going to find a lot of other libraries you may want to use in the future have built around Express and have their own Express plugins and stuff. So that's really useful for us. So for the first one we're going to install is Express. And then we want to add serve static. So this one with 41.4 million downloads by Express, we want to be sure to install that as well. Awesome. Once that one's done, the next up is called Connect History API Fallback. You can see it here with 18 million downloads. And then the last one we want to install is called Express SSLify. And that's, I mean, it's in the name. It's going to help us with SSL setup on our Express application, but we'll go through that in a second. Now that we have all 4 of those dependencies installed, we're going to go back to our server.js and we're going to set up our Express server sort of entry point. And because this is sitting outside of our normal compiled like this file is not going to be compiled with everything else in our production files. This is going to be the file that runs the server that then looks at the production files. So because of that, we actually have to import libraries a little bit differently. So we're going to go const express equals require express. And we're going to do this for all 4 of the libraries that we set up. So serve static equals require serve static. We're going to have const history equals require connect history API fallback. And we're going to have const enforce equals require express SSLify. Awesome. Now that we've imported these 4 new libraries into our server.js, the next step is to create our actual Express application. That's as simple as just saying const app equals express and make sure you run it as a function. And then we want to use app.listen, and this is basically going to run the application. Listen. This is going to run the application, and it's telling us, or it's telling the application to listen to a certain port. So we want to locally run it on port 5000, but we have to do something a little bit different as well, because on Heroku, we can't just tell Heroku what port we want to run on. Heroku tells us what port we're going to be deploying to. And so Heroku has what's called an environment variable called port that we should be running on. And you don't really need to know anything about environment variables. Just know that to reference it, we just say process.end.port, and we're going to just say or 5000. So if there is an environment variable called port, use that. Otherwise, use 5000. So locally, it'll run 5000. Not that we're going to be using this production sort of expressed locally, but yeah, process.port. So we're using the port that Heroku wants us to use, and then fallback or use 5000. Pretty straightforward. Now we have 3 more libraries to sort of implement. So the first one we're going to be doing is app.use. That's how we use sort of middleware for our Express application. And we're going to enforce HTTPS. So we're going to say enforce, which is the Express SSLify, hard to say sometimes, library. And we're going to say .https. I'm going to put a little option in here. This is necessary for Heroku specifically. So trust proto header equals true. Now, my IDE has always just given me this little, hey, we don't know this argument type. It works. This is completely fine. My IDE just doesn't read something properly. I don't know. But you need to enforce HTTPS with the trust proto header. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to force your users to use the secure version of your website, which is always good. Heroku automatically gives you SSL certificates, so you don't need to worry about SSL at all. So if it's already there and it's automatic, let's make sure that we are enforcing it so other users are not accidentally using an unsecure version of our site or unsecure access point for our site. The next thing we're going to do is app.use, and we're going to use the serve static now. And what this does, we're just going to put dir name plus a dist. So what this does is it's going to serve all of our files. If we check here in package, there's actually a build command. And what happens when we deploy to Heroku is Heroku automatically looks in our package JSON for a build command and runs it before it tries to serve our application. So before this server runs, it will actually run this build command. And that build command will compile all of our source code into a /dist folder. And it will be all the minimized, compiled, proper JavaScript files and sort of Webpack chunks and be sitting in this dist folder. And so all we're saying is serve static with this. Serve static is just allowing us to put in dir name, which is because it's Heroku, because we're deploying to another server, we kind of have to put this dir name there just because we don't know what directory we're going to be in, and then dist. So all this line is doing, if you copy it exactly, all you need to know is that this is serving our production compiled files. That's it. The last one we're going to do is app.use history. And this one is the simplest of them all. We're just running history. And this is, if you remember way back when we were doing the router and when we did this create web history, we do have to just serve our production server with this little history middleware in the middle. Otherwise, we're going to run into issues. You don't need to know how it works or why or anything. Just know that putting it in there will stop a bunch of router history issues for your application. Makes it really easy. Just put that in there and that's it. And now that we've created this file, you are completely done. This is all the code necessary to run this in production. So what we're going to do next is I want you to open up your GitHub desktop. Now, if you were smart, if I was smart, probably I would have mentioned this way earlier on, but you could have been committing your changes to this folder through each chapter, potentially, if you wanted to do that. And it's really up to you when you want to commit and how frequently and how big the commits are going to be. Again, I said it would be useful to know a basic understanding of Git. If you don't, that's fine. What we're doing is committing is basically grouping all of the new changes and putting it into sort of one commit or like one little save package, some save state, and then we push it to our repository and then it lives on GitHub forever. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to call this commit initialize project, right? It's like the first commit for the project. It adds all the files and we're going to publish it. Publish it is pretty much the first commit you make to that repository. It makes the sort of repository go live in a sense. From now on, if you ever make commits, it'll just say push, which is like sending that commit to GitHub. And see, if you go to your GitHub repository now, you will see everything is here for you. It also comes with a README, which isn't really necessary. You can change that or remove it if you want with this README here. Yeah, these are all of your files and they're now saved. You can share this with your friends if you want, so they can see all the code that you made. It looks really clean and nice. You've got a homepage that you can look at, and this is all of our code. And this is how, when you make new changes, you'll commit it and push it, and that's how you save new versions of your code. Again, I'm not going to go too much into Git and GitHub in this tutorial because we want to focus on Vue. But if you want to learn more about Git and GitHub, I definitely recommend looking into it because it's quite important, especially if you want a career in front-end engineering. Now, the reason that we committed our code to GitHub is because that is how we're going to be also deploying our code to Heroku. And we're going to be setting it up so every time we push a new commit of our code, it will automatically deploy to production, which makes it really easy for us to make really quick changes that you'll be able to see live online as soon as you save them, really. So what we're going to do is back on our Twitter Heroku application, we're going to go to the deploy tab. click on GitHub, sign in with your GitHub user. I'm already signed in. I'm already connected my GitHub account to my Heroku account. So sign in, connect those up. You should get to this point where you can search for your repository name. I'm going to search for Twatter. Now there's my old one, and there's Twatter tutorial is actually what we did during this video. So I'm going to connect that up. You should have no issues. And now the last thing we're going to do is enable automatic deploys. Now, anytime you push some code to that repository, it's going to deploy it instantly to your Heroku application, which is really awesome and quick. Now, because we've already committed before we set this up, we're going to do deploy branch over here just to manually say, hey, deploy this branch now. And you can see down the bottom here, it's building it. So it's running that build command that was in our package JSON. It's setting up everything we need, installing Node, installing all our dependencies. It automatically, you can see at the top here, the first thing it did, it detected that we want to run a Node.js app, which is really interesting that it can just automatically detect those things. It sets some environment variables. That's what's going on here. Installing NPM, installing our dependencies, all of this sort of cool stuff. It's now running that build command that was sitting inside our package JSON that compiles all of our source code and puts it into that dist folder that we mentioned earlier. And that's what's happening here, building for production. It's now building all of our source code. You can see here it created these files. So all of our code has now been condensed into these 3 files. There's 2 JavaScript files and 1 CSS file. That's it. All of our code has become those 3. And now it is just caching some stuff and doing just some normal DevOps stuff. I hate DevOps, so you really don't need to know much about this. And then build succeeded. That's what you want to see. Discovering process types, ignore all of this and compressing. It's basically saying, hey, this worked. You deployed your application. If we go to the overview now, you can see that it now says deployed. And hopefully, if everything has gone well, you should be able to click this button for open app, and it will take you to the application that you built. And that is live. This link right here, this is no longer just something local to your computer. This is a URL that you can send to your friends, and they can check out the same thing that you've built here today. So we can click on different users. We can go to this. We can go to Mitchell Romney. We can even type in tweets and add that there. Obviously, there's so much more that you can do from here on out, but hopefully this gives you the tools and the knowledge to really build your own project and run with it and Google new features to learn and different approaches to things. Yeah, that's pretty much everything. And the last thing that we can do with Heroku and setting up our production ready application is to set up a domain name. Hey guys, Editing Mitch here. Just wanted to quickly mention that the advice that I'm about to go into is actually specific to paid Heroku dynos. So the lowest price for Heroku dyno is $7 a month. You can set that on your overview page. By default, most users are free. You'll notice in my application, mine instantly went to a paid dyno. That's just because I use Heroku a lot and I do it under a business name. So instantly my Heroku applications become paid. And so using SSL certificates and domain names, that's a paid specific feature. Something I completely forgot while I was making the tutorial because I haven't been using paid dynos in a long time. But yes, if you want to just stick with a free dyno and using Heroku for free, just skip this next step. But yeah, on with the video. So right now, if you go to your application, it's just sitting on herokuapp.com, and that's not really nice when we want to have it. If we've got our own domain name for an application, we want to set it up properly. So what we're going to do is we head over to the settings tab on our application, scroll down to domain, and we want to add a domain here. And I'm going to add twatter.theearthissquare.com. That's theearthissquare.com is a domain that I own, obviously, for The Earth is Square. And it'll give you a domain name, which you obviously just typed in, and a DNS target. So it's important to copy that DNS target and then head over to wherever, if you own a domain, obviously this whole section is not necessary if you don't own a domain. If you own a domain, I own my domain with Namecheap. Go into the DNS settings for your domain, add a new record. I'm going to call it, it has to be a CNAME record. The host is what you want sort of before the domain name. So you see www and API or two other CNAME records I have for The Earth is Square. And then you want to put that DNS target in the value and save it. Now, this may look a little bit different depending on your domain provider. If you don't have a domain, you want to buy one, I do recommend Namecheap. I am not sponsored or anything like that. They're just really, really good. You get really good prices, and they have all the technical stuff necessary, so you don't miss out on any features. I wouldn't recommend something like GoDaddy or whatever, because they sort of inflate their prices, and it's just not a very user-friendly platform when you're, sort of a developer. So set up your CNAME record, Twitter. You have to make sure that whatever you typed in on Heroku, so twitter.theearthissquare, is the exact same thing you put for here for the host, Twitter. Or if you want to make it just www.facebook or whatever, it's www, assuming you own the Facebook domain, which I'd be very surprised. Cool, so that's pretty much it. And then the last thing is we want to set up an SSL certificate for this domain. As I said before, Heroku does this automatically. So all you need to do is go to Configure SSL, click on Automatic Certificate Management, click Next. That's it. Your certificate is automatically being managed. That's all you have to do, is just say, hey, do it. Manage it for me. That's it. Now you can see down here, we're still waiting on the ACM status. That's just because DNS settings can sometimes take a little bit of time to work. It has to sort of propagate throughout a few different things. So it can take a couple minutes. It can take up to an hour, sometimes. So you just want to be a bit patient with it. But, sometimes it works instantly. It's great. Refresh the ACM status. And if you've got OK, you're all good. And right now, I can just go to twitter.theearthissquare.com. And there we go. But yeah, that is it. That is the end of our Vue 3 course. Our Vue 3 everything tutorial. We've packed a lot. I've been recording this video the entire day, so hopefully it comes together well. I do have a couple things to sort of end the video here, a couple things to mention if you want to learn some more. So in terms of more advanced topics or things that aren't really necessary to start your application like we have done today, but for more something niche that may come up in the future with your project, there's a lot of other topics for you to look into, such as transitions, teleport, which is new to Vue 3. You've got mix-ins, plugins, and slots. These are all different concepts that are worth looking into once you feel like you've gotten a grasp on the basics of Vue. You can also look into upgrading to TypeScript. Now, I tend to do a lot of work nowadays using TypeScript. A lot of developers are moving towards TypeScript. I don't have time in this video to go into why today, but it is something for you to look into in the future, is look into TypeScript and upgrading Vue from JavaScript to TypeScript. It's really a simple process. Vue makes it very easy to do. Some last little tidbits. Alongside this video, I do want to eventually, this might take a while though, but make a backend series to accompany it, so you guys can build a front end and build a backend with a database and build a full stack application using these couple of tutorials. So that's the plan. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. I also have a personal channel. It's just Mitchell Romney. You'll be able to find it in the description below, and on my channel list for the Earth is Square. The videos on there, as I'm recording this, are a handful of commentary videos of me just trying new things. There's probably going to be some more personalized videos in the future. I'm going to be trying a lot of new stuff, but the Earth is Square here is like tutorials and coding stuff. If you want to get to know me, Mitchell, and this stupid humor I have and the jokes I'm trying to make and all the other stuff, definitely go check out my personal channel. I would really appreciate it. As always, if there's anything that you didn't see covered in this video, or you saw covered but would like more information on, more in-depth standalone video, let me know in the comments down below. If everyone is sort of requesting me to go into something more in-depth, then that's something I'll definitely jump on. The same with if it's nothing to do with Vue, you want me to do something on a Python or Rust. People have requested Django stuff. If you want me to do some more stuff on TypeScript, backend, frontend, whatever. I'm currently, even though I have mainly worked in my profession as a Vue developer, I actually now work as a React developer. So there could be a React video sometime in the future as well. So definitely let me know in the comments. Again, if everyone wants me to do something, then I will jump on that, of course, to provide you guys with the information that you need. So lastly, as everyone likes to sign off their videos, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. What you thought of the content. There are some links to social media and a Discord channel and stuff in the description below. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'm pretty tired. You might be able to hear in my voice at this point. I've been recording for many hours now. So hopefully this turned out well. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. And I will see you guys on the next video.